Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The humidity hit me the moment I stepped out of the unmarked sedan. Miami in September. Thick air that wrapped around you like wet fabric, carrying the smell of salt water and diesel fuel from the port. It was just past 2 a.m. and the docks were supposed to be quiet. That's what the intel said anyway. I'm Special Agent Reed Morrison, FBI Miami Field Office. 12 years with the Bureau, 8 of them down here in South Florida. You'd think I'd be used to the night work by now, but something about the docks always put me on edge. Maybe it was the way sound traveled differently over water, or how the sodium lights created these deep pockets of shadow between the shipping containers. Or maybe it was just that nothing good ever happened at the Miami docks after midnight. My partner for the night was Agent Kyle Brennan, a transfer from the Chicago office who'd been in Miami for less than 6 months. He was good at his job, methodical and calm under pressure, but he hadn't fully adjusted to the Florida climate yet. I could see sweat already beading on his forehead as he checked his service weapon and secured his body camera to his vest. "You good?" I asked, keeping my voice low even though we were alone in the parking lot of a closed marina about 200 yards from our target location. "Yeah," Brennan said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Just trying to figure out why anyone would choose to live in this sauna." I allowed myself a brief smile. "You get used to it. Give it another year." "If I make it another year," he muttered, but there was no real complaint in his voice, just the kind of dark humor that keeps you sane in this line of work. The case we were working had started 3 weeks earlier with a tip from a confidential informant, someone with connections to a smuggling operation running through the port of Miami. The details were vague, which wasn't unusual. Most CIs didn't have the full picture, just fragments. Shipments arriving at irregular intervals, always late at night, always at the same warehouse on the eastern edge of the port. No manifests, no paperwork trail, nothing in the Port Authority's official logs. What made this case interesting wasn't just the smuggling angle. The Bureau had dozens of those running at any given time. What caught our attention was the pattern, or rather the lack of one. Smugglers, even sophisticated ones, tend to fall into predictable rhythms. They use the same routes, the same contacts, the same methods because consistency minimizes risk. But this operation seemed almost random. Shipments would arrive on different nights with no discernible pattern. Sometimes weeks would pass between deliveries, sometimes just days. And then there was the warehouse itself. According to port records, it had been leased to a shell corporation 6 months ago, but no legitimate cargo had passed through it since. The few times port security had done routine sweeps, they'd found nothing. Just an empty building with concrete floors and rusted loading equipment. But our CI insisted something was happening there. He'd seen vehicles coming and going, always the same white panel van with no plates, and he'd heard things. That's what he'd said during our last meeting. "I've heard things, man. Weird things." When I pressed him for details, he'd gotten nervous, started looking over his shoulder. "Just check it out at night," he'd said. "You'll see what I mean." So here we were, conducting what the Bureau officially called a surveillance and reconnaissance operation, and what Brennan and I called sitting in the dark and hoping something interesting happens. The plan was simple. We'd approach the warehouse from the water side, using the maze of shipping containers and dormant cargo equipment as cover. Once we were in position, we'd set up our mobile surveillance cameras and settle in for a long night of watching and waiting. If we were lucky, we'd catch someone in the act. If we were really lucky, we'd be able to make an arrest and flip whoever we caught into giving up the bigger fish. But something about this felt off to me. Had felt off since I first read the case file. I couldn't put my finger on it exactly, just a nagging sense that we were missing something obvious, something important. We moved through the marina's parking lot in silence, staying low and keeping to the shadows. The sodium lights overhead cast everything in a sickly orange glow, and I could hear the rhythmic slap of water against the dock pilings. The port was never truly silent. There was always the low hum of generators, the distant rumble of trucks on the highway, the occasional blast of a ship's horn from somewhere out in the channel. But tonight it all seemed muted, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The warehouse was about a quarter-mile away, situated on a concrete peninsula that jutted out into the port's eastern basin. To get there without being seen, we had to navigate through a landscape of industrial detritus, abandoned forklifts, empty pallets stacked 10 feet high, rusted shipping containers with their doors hanging open like broken jaws. As we moved, I kept scanning our surroundings, looking for any sign of activity. My hand rested on my Glock, thumb near the safety, a habit I'd developed over years of night operations. Brennan moved beside me, his breathing steady but audible in the humid air. About halfway to the warehouse, I stopped. Brennan nearly bumped into me, caught himself, and gave me a questioning look. I held up a hand for silence and tilted my head, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the usual ambient noise of the port. Then I heard it again, a faint, metallic scraping sound, like a door hinge that needed oil. It came from somewhere ahead of us, in the direction of the warehouse. I pointed toward the sound and mouthed the word, "Hear that?" Brennan nodded, his expression suddenly more alert. We waited, counting seconds in our heads, listening for the sound to repeat. It didn't. After a full minute of silence, we resumed our approach. But now every nerve in my body was on high alert. The scraping sound could have been anything. Wind moving a loose piece of sheet metal, an animal disturbing something in the dark. But it could also have been a door opening, someone entering or exiting the warehouse. When we finally reached the edge of the container yard, we had a clear line of sight to the warehouse. It was exactly as the files described. A single-story concrete structure with a flat roof, maybe 60 feet long and 40 feet wide. There were no windows, just a large rolling door on the landward side and a smaller personnel entrance adjacent to it. The building looked abandoned, forgotten, the kind of place you'd walk past without a second glance. But I knew better. Someone had gone to the trouble of leasing this place, and someone was paying to keep it off the official radar. That meant it was worth watching. We set up our position behind a cluster of empty containers, about 50 yards from the warehouse's main entrance. From here, we had good coverage of both doors and a partial view of the loading area. Brennan unpacked the surveillance equipment, 2 high-definition cameras with night vision capability, a digital recorder, and a wireless relay that would transmit everything back to our vehicle. While Brennan worked on positioning the cameras, I scanned the warehouse through my binoculars. The building was dark, no lights visible from any angle. The rolling door was closed, padlocked from the outside. The personnel entrance also appeared secure. No vehicles in the immediate area, no fresh tire tracks in the dusty ground around the building. "Cameras are live," Brennan whispered, checking the feed on his tablet. "We've got good coverage on both entrances. Battery should last until sunrise if we need it." "Good," I said, settling into a more comfortable position. Now we wait. Waiting is 90% of surveillance work, and it's the part they don't show in movies. It's not exciting or dramatic. It's just long stretches of nothing punctuated by brief moments of intense focus. You learn to keep your mind occupied while still remaining alert, to notice the patterns in seemingly random events, to distinguish between normal activity and something worth investigating. The first hour passed without incident. A freight train rumbled past on the tracks that ran along the port's northern edge. A cargo ship's horn sounded from somewhere out in the bay. The lights of downtown Miami glowed on the western horizon, a reminder that while we sat here in the industrial dark, the city was still alive, still moving, oblivious to what we were doing. Around 3:30 a.m., Brennan tapped my shoulder and pointed at his tablet. "Feed's flickering on camera 2, he said quietly. I leaned over to look. The image from the camera covering the main entrance was stuttering, pixelating every few seconds before resolving back to normal. "Could be interference," I said. "Sometimes the radio equipment from the ships can cause issues." "Maybe," Brennan said, but he didn't sound convinced. He tapped the screen, trying to stabilize the image. "It's only affecting this one camera, though. The other one's fine." As I watched, the feed flickered again, and for just a moment, maybe half a second, I thought I saw something in the frame. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, near the personnel entrance to the warehouse, but then the image stabilized, and there was nothing there. "Did you see that?" I asked. "See what?" "On the screen, just now, something near the door." Brennan rewound the feed and played it back in slow motion. We both leaned in close, studying every frame. The flicker was there, a brief disruption in the video signal, but I couldn't make out any definite shape or movement. It could have been anything. A compression artifact, a moth flying past the camera lens, my tired eyes playing tricks on me. "I don't see anything specific," Brennan said. "Could be your imagination." "Yeah, probably," I agreed, but I made a mental note to review the footage more carefully later. One thing I'd learned over the years: trust your instincts, even when you can't explain them. Another hour crept past. The humidity seemed to be getting worse, if that was possible, and my shirt was completely soaked through with sweat. Brennan had stopped trying to stay dry and was now just accepting his fate, occasionally taking small sips from his water bottle to stay hydrated. At 4:47 a.m., according to my watch, something changed. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, just a subtle shift in the atmosphere that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The ambient noise of the port seemed to fade slightly, as if someone had turned down the volume on the world. The air felt heavier, more oppressive. I sat up straighter, suddenly fully alert. Brennan noticed my reaction and immediately tensed. "What is it?" he whispered. "Not sure," I said, scanning the warehouse and surrounding area. Everything looked exactly the same as it had a minute ago. No movement, no lights, no sign of any activity, but something was definitely different. I could feel it in my gut, that primal awareness that every good agent learns to listen to. Then I heard it, so faint I almost missed it. A rhythmic sound, like footsteps on concrete, coming from inside the warehouse. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone were pacing back and forth. The sound was barely audible over the background noise of the port, but once I'd heard it, I couldn't unhear it. I grabbed Brennan's arm and pointed at the warehouse. "Someone's inside," I mouthed silently. His eyes widened slightly, and he checked his tablet. "Cameras aren't showing anything," he whispered. "No heat signatures, no movement." That didn't make sense. We had thermal imaging cameras as backup, specifically designed to detect body heat through walls. If someone was inside the warehouse, the cameras should have picked them up. Unless the walls were lined with something that blocked thermal radiation, but that seemed unlikely for an abandoned building. The footsteps continued, steady and unhurried. They seemed to be moving from one end of the warehouse to the other, then back again. Pacing, Someone was definitely pacing inside that building, and for reasons I couldn't explain, that bothered me more than if we'd caught them doing something obviously illegal. "I'm going to check it out," I said quietly, already starting to move. Brennan grabbed my arm. "Protocol says we call it in first, get backup before approaching." "I know the protocol," I said, gently pulling free from his grip. "But if we call it in now, by the time backup arrives, whoever's in there will be gone. I'm just going to do a visual sweep, see if I can figure out what's going on. You stay here and monitor the feeds. Read, that's an order, Agent Brennan." He didn't like it. I could see the conflict in his face, but he nodded. "Keep your radio on. First sign of trouble, you call it in." "Will do," I said, checking my weapon one more time before moving out from our concealed position. Approaching the warehouse felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Every instinct I had was telling me to stay back, to wait for daylight, to call for backup. But I'd learned not to let fear dictate my actions. Fear was just information, your body's way of telling you to be careful. As long as you acknowledged it and worked with it rather than against it, it could keep you alive. I moved quickly but quietly, using the scattered industrial equipment as cover. The footsteps inside the warehouse had stopped, which somehow made me even more nervous than when I could hear them. At least then I'd known where the person was. When I reached the building's exterior wall, I pressed myself flat against the concrete and inched toward the personnel entrance. The door was metal, painted a faded green that had rusted through in several places. A heavy padlock secured it from the outside, and there was no obvious sign that it had been tampered with recently. But if the door was locked from the outside, how had someone gotten inside? I moved along the wall toward the main rolling door, keeping low and watching for any sign of movement. This door was also secured, this time with a chain and padlock that looked relatively new. I examined the lock closely. No scratches or tool marks that might indicate forced entry. So both doors were locked from the outside. The thermal cameras showed no heat signatures inside, and yet I'd clearly heard footsteps. Either I was losing my mind or something very strange was going on. I activated my body camera with a subtle tap on the control mounted to my vest, making sure everything would be recorded from this point forward. Then I pulled out my flashlight and shone it through a narrow gap between the rolling door and the concrete frame. The beam cut through the darkness inside, illuminating nothing, just an empty concrete floor scattered with old debris, broken pallets, scraps of cardboard, a few rusty metal drums. I moved the light slowly, scanning as much of the interior as I could see from this limited angle. Empty, completely empty. No people, no smuggled goods, no sign that anyone had been inside this building in weeks. But I'd heard those footsteps. I was certain of it. My radio crackled softly. Brennan checking in. "Anything?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Negative," I replied, still studying the interior through the gap. "Building appears empty. Doors are secured from the outside. I don't see how anyone could be in there." "Could it have been coming from somewhere else? Sound can do weird things in industrial areas." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. The footsteps had been too clear, too distinct. They'd definitely come from inside this warehouse. I was about to head back to our surveillance position when I noticed something odd. The gap between the door and the frame, the one I'd been shining my light through, seemed to be getting narrower. Not much, maybe a fraction of an inch, but enough to be noticeable. As if the door were slowly settling into place, or as if something on the other side were pushing against it. I stepped back from the door and watched it carefully. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, very slowly, I saw it move. Not much, less than a centimeter. But it definitely moved, the chain going slightly more taut as the door pressed outward against it. "Brennan," "You seeing this on the cameras?" I said into my radio, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline starting to flood my system. "Negative. The angles don't give us a good view of that door. What's going on?" The door just moved, like something pushed it from inside. "I'm coming to you," Brennan said immediately. "Negative. Stay in position," I ordered. "I'm going to circle the building, see if there's another entrance I missed." I moved quickly around the warehouse's perimeter, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The building had no windows, no other doors, no obvious way in or out except the two entrances I'd already checked. The walls were solid concrete, no cracks or holes large enough for a person to slip through. Which meant that either someone had been locked inside when the doors were secured, or I was experiencing some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by lack of sleep and too much Miami humidity. I completed my circuit of the building and returned to the main entrance, checking the lock again. Still secure, no signs of tampering. The door hadn't moved again since that first time, and I couldn't hear any sounds from inside. "Reed," Brennan's voice came through my radio, urgent but controlled. "I'm getting that flicker again on camera 2, worse than before." "On my way back," I said, taking one last look at the warehouse before retreating to our surveillance position. When I got back to where Brennan was set up, he showed me his tablet. The feed from camera 2 was flickering badly now, the image breaking up every few seconds into blocks of distorted pixels. But what caught my attention wasn't the technical glitch. It was what appeared in some of those distorted frames. In the moments when the image stabilized, there was definitely a shadow visible near the personnel entrance. Not a full silhouette, nothing you could point to and definitively say, "That's a person," but a patch of darkness that seemed somehow denser than the surrounding shadows. And in the seconds when the camera flickered, that shadow appeared to move, shifting position in ways that didn't match the stationary angle of the camera. "That's not a compression artifact," Brennan said quietly. "That's something." We watched in silence as the camera continued to flicker and the shadow continued its strange, stuttering movement. It would appear near the door, then in the next frame, be several feet to the left, then back near the door again, as if it were phasing in and out of existence. "We need to call this in," Brennan said. "Get a full team down here, proper equipment." He was right, of course. This was beyond what the two of us could handle with our limited surveillance setup. But I hesitated, knowing that once we called it in, once this became an official operation with multiple agents and supervisors involved, we'd lose any chance of keeping this quiet. And something told me that whatever was happening here, it needed to stay quiet, at least until we understood it better. "Let's give it another hour," I said. "See if anyone actually shows up. If this shadow is just a camera glitch, I don't want to drag half the office down here in the middle of the night." Brennan looked like he wanted to argue, but he nodded. 1 hour, then we call it in, shadow or no shadow. For the next 45 minutes, we watched the feeds in silence. The flickering continued, irregular and impossible to predict. Sometimes the shadow was visible, sometimes it wasn't. At one point, camera 1, which had been working perfectly, also started to flicker, though less severely than camera 2. Then, at exactly 6:03 a.m. according to the timestamp on the video, both cameras went completely dark. Not flickering, not distorted, just black, as if someone had unplugged them. "What the hell?" Brennan said, frantically checking his equipment. "I'm not reading any power loss. The cameras should still be transmitting." "Maybe someone found them and disabled them," I suggested, already moving back toward the warehouse. "No way," Brennan said, following me. "They're wireless and well hidden. Nobody could have spotted them in the dark." We reached our camera positions within minutes. Both devices were exactly where we'd left them, still mounted securely, still powered on according to the indicator lights. But when Brennan checked the feeds on his tablet, all he got was a black screen. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered, manually adjusting the camera angles. "Everything's working, the cameras are on, they're transmitting, but we're not getting any image." I looked at the warehouse. The sky was starting to lighten in the east, that pre-dawn gray that comes before sunrise. In another hour, the port would begin to wake up, workers arriving for the morning shift, trucks moving cargo, the normal bustle of commercial activity. Whatever window we'd had for observing this place undisturbed was closing fast. "Brennan," I said slowly, "when did you last review the footage from tonight? The stuff we recorded before the cameras went out?" "Haven't had time," he said, still fiddling with the equipment. "Why?" "Because I want to see if anything else showed up on those feeds. Anything we might have missed while we were focused on that shadow." He stopped what he was doing and looked at me. "You think we missed something?" "I think we're missing a lot of things," I said. "And I want to know what they are before we file our report." We packed up the surveillance equipment and headed back to our vehicle as the sun began to rise over Miami. The whole drive back to the office, neither of us spoke much. We were both trying to process what we'd experienced, or, more accurately, what we couldn't explain about what we'd experienced. Back at the FBI field office, we spent the next 3 hours reviewing every frame of footage we'd captured. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Static shots of an empty building, occasional flickers and distortions in the video signal, the shadow that appeared and disappeared near the personnel entrance. But there was one segment, lasting exactly 3 seconds, that neither of us could explain. It occurred at 4:52 a.m., right around the time I'd first heard the footsteps. For 3 seconds, camera 2 captured something moving inside the warehouse, visible through the gap between the rolling door and the frame. The footage was grainy and the angle wasn't great, but there was definitely movement. A shape, roughly human-sized, crossing from one side of the interior to the other. We must have watched those 3 seconds 50 times, frame by frame, trying to make out any details. The shape was dark, undefined, moving with a strange fluidity that didn't quite look natural. It appeared in frame 3, was fully visible for about 1.5 seconds, then disappeared again, leaving no trace. "Could be a person," Brennan said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Could be," I agreed. "But if it was, how did they get in there, and how did they get out? We had eyes on those doors the entire time." "Maybe there's a third entrance we didn't find, a tunnel or something. In a warehouse that's barely used? For what purpose?" Brennan didn't have an answer for that, and neither did I. We filed our preliminary report that afternoon, keeping the details vague. We described the surveillance operation, noted the camera malfunctions, mentioned the unusual shadow visible in some frames. We didn't mention the footsteps I'd heard or the 3-second segment of unexplainable movement. Not because we were trying to hide anything, but because we didn't know how to explain it in a way that wouldn't sound crazy. Our supervising agent read the report, asked a few questions about the camera issues, and authorized a follow-up operation for the following week. "Get better equipment this time," he said. "And maybe bring a tech specialist with you, someone who can figure out what's causing those glitches." We agreed, but I already knew we wouldn't find anything. Whatever was happening at that warehouse, it wasn't something better equipment would help us understand. That night, lying in bed and trying to sleep, I kept thinking about those 3 seconds of footage, about the shape moving through the darkness, about the footsteps that shouldn't have been possible, about the shadow that appeared and disappeared like something out of a nightmare. And I thought about what our CI had said. "I've heard things, man. Weird things." He'd been right. There were definitely weird things happening at that warehouse. The question was, What were they, and why? I didn't have answers yet, but I knew I wouldn't be able to let this case go until I found them. The thing about surveillance work is that it gives you a lot of time to think. Sometimes that's a good thing. You notice patterns, make connections, solve problems that seem unsolvable in the chaos of active investigation. But sometimes it's a curse, because your mind starts filling in gaps with speculation, building narratives out of insufficient data. Over the next few days, I found myself constantly thinking about the warehouse. I pulled up satellite images, looking for any feature I might have missed during our nighttime reconnaissance. I reviewed the case file a dozen times, searching for details that might explain what we'd observed. I even tracked down our CI and tried to get more information out of him, but he'd gone to ground, not responding to any of my messages. Brennan was handling it better than I was. He'd compartmentalized the experience, filed it away as an unsolved mystery, and moved on to other cases. That's probably the healthier approach, but I've never been good at letting things go. On the fourth day after our initial surveillance, I got a call from the Port Authority. They'd received a complaint from a shipping company about suspicious activity near the Eastern Basin, our warehouse. Apparently, one of their night security guards had reported seeing lights in the building and hearing strange sounds, similar to what we'd experienced. I immediately contacted Brennan and suggested we go back that night, this time with the better equipment our supervisor had authorized. He was reluctant. We both had other active cases that probably deserved more attention, but he agreed. The equipment we brought with us the second time was considerably more sophisticated. We had thermal imaging cameras with longer range and better resolution, audio recording devices sensitive enough to pick up conversations from 100 yards away, and cameras with enhanced night vision capability that could supposedly see in near total darkness. We arrived at the port around 11 p.m., earlier than our first visit, and set up our observation post in the same location. The night was marginally cooler than last time, with a breeze coming in off the Atlantic that offered some relief from the humidity. The warehouse looked exactly as it had before, dark, abandoned, seemingly empty. "Cameras are live and recording," Brennan said, checking his equipment. "All systems green. Let's see if we can figure out what's going on in there." For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. The feeds were stable, showing the same static image of the warehouse entrance. No flickering, no distortions, no mysterious shadows. Just a boring, ordinary, abandoned building. I was starting to think we'd wasted our time when at 1:17 a.m., the audio sensors picked up something. It started as a low hum, barely audible but definitely present. The frequency was strange, too low to be mechanical, too steady to be natural. It rose and fell in a slow rhythm, like breathing, or like waves lapping against a shore. "You hearing this?" I asked Brennan, who was already adjusting the audio settings to try to isolate the sound. "Yeah," he said, frowning at his tablet. "Can't pinpoint the source, though. It's like it's coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time." The humming continued for about 3 minutes, then stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I became aware of how quiet the port had become. The usual background noise, distant traffic, ship engines, machinery, all seemed to have faded away, leaving only the sound of our breathing and the gentle rustle of wind through the container yard. Then came the footsteps. They were clearer this time, more distinct than during our first visit. Slow, measured steps on concrete, coming from inside the warehouse. They started at one end of the building and moved toward the other, then stopped. Silence for maybe 10 seconds. Then the footsteps resumed, moving back in the opposite direction. Brennan and I exchanged looks. His face reflected the same mixture of unease and fascination I was feeling. We were both trained federal agents, experienced investigators who'd seen plenty of strange things over the course of our careers. But this was different. This was something we couldn't immediately categorize or explain. "Check the thermal imaging," I said quietly. Brennan pulled up the thermal feed on his tablet. The screen showed the warehouse rendered in false color, with temperature differentials displayed as variations in hue. The building itself registered as cool blue, exactly what you'd expect from concrete that had been sitting in the shade all day. But there was something else. A small spot of warmth, maybe person-sized, moving through the interior of the warehouse. It wasn't red hot like a human body would be, more of a pale yellow, like something that was slightly warmer than ambient temperature, but not significantly so. "There," Brennan said, pointing at the screen. "Whatever it is, it's definitely there." We watched as the warm spot moved from one end of the warehouse to the other, its path corresponding exactly with the footsteps we could hear through the audio sensors. When the footsteps stopped, the spot stopped. When they resumed, it moved again. "Could be someone who's really good at avoiding being seen," Brennan suggested. "Maybe they're wearing something that masks their heat signature partially." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. The doors were still locked from the outside. We'd verified that before setting up our equipment. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside without us seeing them arrive. The footsteps continued for another 10 minutes, following the same pattern. Walk from one end of the building to the other. Pause. Walk back. It was methodical, almost ritualistic, like a guard doing rounds or a prisoner pacing in a cell. Then, without warning, the thermal spot disappeared. One moment it was there, clearly visible on the screen, and the next, it was gone. The footsteps stopped at the same instant. Brennan checked all his equipment, making sure we hadn't lost the signal. Everything was working perfectly. The thermal camera was still active, still recording, still transmitting. The warm spot had simply vanished, as if whatever had been generating it had suddenly ceased to exist. "What the hell?" Brennan muttered, reviewing the footage. "Where did it go?" I didn't answer. I was too focused on the warehouse itself, watching for any sign of movement, any indication of what we were dealing with. For the next 20 minutes, nothing happened. The building remained silent and dark. The thermal imaging showed no anomalies. Even the strange humming sound didn't return. Then, at exactly 2:00 a.m., all of our camera feeds flickered simultaneously. Not just the ones pointed at the warehouse, but all of them, including the backups we'd set up to record our observation post. The flicker lasted maybe half a second, but when the images stabilized, something had changed. The warehouse's personnel entrance, the one that had been securely padlocked from the outside, was now standing slightly ajar. "Did you see that?" I asked, already moving. "Wait," Brennan said, grabbing my arm. "Reed, we need to think about this. Something's not right." "I know something's not right," I said, pulling free. "That's why I'm going to check it out. You stay here and keep recording. At least wait for backup." "There's no time," I said, though I wasn't sure why I felt that way. Just an instinct, a sense of urgency that I couldn't explain. If someone's in there, I need to see who they are. I approached the warehouse more cautiously this time, my weapon drawn, my body camera recording everything. The personnel entrance was indeed open, the door hanging inward just enough to create a gap of about 6 inches. The padlock was still in place on the outside, but somehow the door had come open anyway. I shone my flashlight through the gap, illuminating the interior. Empty. Just like before, nothing but concrete floor and scattered debris. No sign of whoever, or whatever, had been making those footsteps. I pushed the door open wider, wincing at the screech of rusted hinges. "FBI!" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the confined space, If anyone's in here, make yourself known." No response, just the echo of my own voice bouncing off concrete walls. I stepped inside, sweeping my flashlight and weapon in coordinated movements, clearing each corner before proceeding. The warehouse was bigger than it had looked from outside, maybe 70 feet long and 50 feet wide, with a ceiling about 20 feet high. The air inside was stale and damp, smelling of rust and decay. Along the walls, I could see the remnants of whatever operations had once taken place here. Mounting brackets where machinery had been installed, stains on the concrete where chemicals had spilled, a metal staircase leading up to a small observation platform near the ceiling. But no people, no smuggled goods. Nothing that would explain the footsteps or the thermal signatures or any of the other strange phenomena we'd been documenting. I was about to call back to Brennan when I noticed something odd. On the far wall, near the rolling door, there was a pattern of shadows that didn't quite match the geometry of the room. My flashlight beam seemed to behave strangely in that area, the light diffusing in ways that didn't make physical sense. I walked closer, studying the shadows. As I approached, I became aware of a sound, so faint I almost missed it. A whisper? No, not quite. More like the sound of wind through a narrow opening. But there was no opening, no draft that I could detect. The sound seemed to be coming from the shadows themselves, as if the darkness were somehow vocal. I know how that sounds. Crazy. Impossible. But that's what I heard, or thought I heard. A voice made of shadow, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. "Reed," Brennan's voice crackled through my radio, making me jump. "You need to see this." "Kind of busy," I replied, still staring at the shadows. "No, seriously, you need to see this right now. The cameras just captured something." Reluctantly, I backed away from the wall and exited the warehouse. As I emerged into the relatively fresh air of the port, I realized I'd been holding my breath without knowing it. My heart was racing, and I had to consciously slow my breathing to normal. When I got back to Brennan's position, he showed me his tablet. On the screen was frozen footage from one of our cameras, showing the interior of the warehouse through the gap in the rolling door. The timestamp indicated it had been captured about 30 seconds ago, while I was inside the building. In the frame, clearly visible, was a figure. Not a shadow or a thermal anomaly, but an actual human shape, standing in the exact spot where I'd been moments before the image was captured. But here's the thing, there had been no one else in that warehouse. I'd cleared the entire space, checked every corner, every possible hiding spot. I was alone in there, and yet, there on the screen, was undeniable evidence of someone else's presence. "That's not possible," I said, though I was really just stating the obvious. "I know," Brennan said quietly, "but there it is." We reviewed the footage frame by frame. The figure appeared in exactly 3 frames, lasting just over 1 second of real time. It was dark, indistinct, but definitely human-shaped. About 6 feet tall, standing motionless in the center of the warehouse. "Run it again," I said. "Let me see the frames right before and after." Brennan complied, and we watched in silence as the sequence played out. Frame 1, empty warehouse. Frame 2, empty warehouse. Frame 3, figure present. Frame 4, figure present. Frame 5, figure present. Frame 6, empty warehouse again. It appeared and disappeared without any transition, without any movement between states. One moment, nothing. The next moment, something. Then nothing again. "Could be a compression artifact," Brennan suggested, though his tone made it clear he didn't believe that. "Or maybe lens flare, or—" "It's not a compression artifact," I said firmly. "That's something real. something that was in there with me. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us trying to process what we were looking at. In all my years with the Bureau, I'd never encountered anything like this. Sure, I'd worked cases involving unusual circumstances, unexplained elements, things that didn't immediately make sense, but those had always resolved eventually into rational explanations, mistakes, misunderstandings, perfectly natural phenomena that seemed strange only because we didn't have all the information. This felt different. This felt like something that wouldn't resolve no matter how much information we gathered. "We need to seal this building," I said finally. "Get a full forensic team down here, proper lighting, go through it inch by inch. Maybe we're missing something obvious, something that explains all of this. And if we don't find anything," Brennan asked, "then we keep looking until we do." But even as I said it, I knew we weren't going to find a neat explanation. Whatever was happening at this warehouse, it wasn't the kind of thing that could be solved with better equipment or more thorough investigation. As we packed up our gear and prepared to leave, I took one last look at the building. The door had closed itself somehow. It was shut tight again, though we hadn't touched it. The padlock hung from its latch, seemingly undisturbed. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, dawn approaching with the promise of another hot Miami day. In a few hours, the port would be alive with activity, workers and cargo, and the normal bustle of commerce. The warehouse would just be another anonymous building in an industrial landscape, notable only for its emptiness. But I knew better now. I knew there was something in there. Something that left shadows on our cameras, and warm spots on our thermal imaging, and footprints on our audio sensors. Something that appeared when we weren't looking and vanished when we were. And I knew that whatever it wasn't finished with us yet. The forensic team arrived at the warehouse the following Monday, just after sunrise. 6 specialists from our Miami office, along with 2 technicians from the Bureau's evidence response team, all equipped with the most advanced investigative equipment the FBI had to offer. If there was something to find in that building, they would find it. I watched from a distance as they worked, methodically documenting every inch of the warehouse's interior and exterior. They took photographs, collected samples, ran tests on the concrete and the air and the metal fittings. They brought in portable lights that turned the dim interior into something approximating daylight, eliminating all those suspicious shadows. Brennan and I had submitted our full report over the weekend, including the footage we'd captured and our observations about the anomalies. Our supervisor had reviewed it carefully, asked several pointed questions about the camera malfunctions, and ultimately authorized the full forensic workup. What we didn't include in our report were the parts that sounded too strange, too impossible to be credible. The shadow voice I'd heard, the feeling of being watched from empty space, the sense of wrongness that permeated that building like a physical presence. Some things you just don't put in official documents, not if you want to maintain your credibility. By mid-afternoon, the forensic team had completed their initial sweep. I met with their lead investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Special Agent Rita Martinez who'd been doing this work for 15 years. "Find anything interesting?" I asked, though I already suspected what her answer would be. "Define interesting," Martinez said, consulting her tablet. "The building is definitely abandoned, hasn't seen regular use in at least 6 months, maybe longer. We found some trace evidence of previous occupancy, oil stains from machinery, chemical residue consistent with industrial cleaning products, the usual detritus you'd expect from a warehouse that's been through multiple tenants over the years. But nothing recent. Nothing that would explain your surveillance footage. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of anyone being inside the building recently. The dust patterns on the floor are undisturbed. Nobody's been walking around in there." I thought about the footsteps Brennan and I had heard. the thermal signature we'd captured moving through the interior. What about the door? The personnel entrance that somehow opened while we were watching. Martinez made a face. That's the weird part. The lock mechanism is damaged, has been for a while, looks like. The padlock on the outside is just for show. The actual door latch is broken. A strong wind, or even just settling of the building, could cause it to swing open. There was no wind that night, I said. Doesn't have to be literal wind. Changes in air pressure, seismic settling, thermal expansion. Lots of things could cause a door to move, especially an old, damaged door in a building that's not maintained. She was right, of course. Everything she was saying made perfect sense. And yet it didn't explain what we'd experienced, didn't account for the sum total of the anomalies we'd documented. What about the thermal signature? I asked. We definitely recorded something warm moving through the building. Could be residual heat from machinery or equipment that was recently removed. Could be temperature differentials in the concrete itself. Thermal imaging is useful, but it's not perfect. It can show you things that seem significant but turn out to have mundane explanations. And the figure we captured on camera, the one that appeared for 3 seconds then vanished? Martinez hesitated before answering this one. That's harder to explain, she admitted. Could be a technical glitch, could be someone who managed to get in and out without leaving traces. But honestly, Agent Morrison, 3 seconds isn't much to work with. It could be almost anything. I wanted to argue, to insist that what we'd documented was real and significant. But I also knew how I'd sound, like an agent who was too invested in a case, who was seeing patterns where none existed, who was letting his imagination run away with him. Thanks for the thorough work, I said instead. Let me know if you find anything else. Will do, Martinez said, then added in a gentler tone, Look, I know you and Brennan saw something that bothered you. I'm not dismissing that. But sometimes in this job we encounter things that seem inexplicable at first, but turn out to have perfectly rational explanations. Give it time. The answer will probably become clear. I nodded and thanked her again, but I didn't believe her. Time wasn't going to make this clearer. Time was just going to bury it under other cases, other priorities, until eventually it became just another unsolved mystery filed away in the Bureau's archives. That night, I went back to the warehouse alone. I know that sounds foolish, going to an active investigation site without backup, without authorization, without even telling anyone where I was. But I had to see it for myself. Had to spend time in that space without the distraction of equipment and protocols and other agents watching over my shoulder. I arrived around midnight, parking my personal vehicle in the same marina lot we'd used for our surveillance. The walk to the warehouse felt different this time. Maybe because I knew I was alone. Maybe because I wasn't operating under the structure of an official investigation. The building looked exactly as it had the last time I'd seen it. Dark, silent, abandoned. The personnel entrance was closed and padlocked, though now I knew that lock was mostly cosmetic. I could open this door if I wanted to, could slip inside and spend however long I needed to in there. But I didn't. Not right away. Instead, I circled the building slowly, studying it from every angle, trying to understand what made this particular warehouse significant. There were dozens of similar structures in the port of Miami, hundreds maybe. What made this one special? Why had our CI singled it out? Why had we experienced those anomalies here and nowhere else? The moon was nearly full that night, casting everything in silver light that seemed almost too bright after the darkness I'd been accustomed to. I could see the warehouse clearly, could make out details on its concrete walls that had been invisible during our nighttime surveillance. And that's when I noticed something I'd missed before. On the wall, facing the water, about 15 feet up from the ground, there was a symbol carved into the concrete. It wasn't large, maybe 6 inches across, and it had been weathered by years of salt air and rain until it was barely visible. But in the moonlight, from this particular angle, I could just make it out. It looked like a circle with several lines radiating from it, like a simplified representation of the sun. But there was something off about the proportions, something that made it look less like a sun and more like, what, an eye? A portal? I couldn't quite say. I pulled out my phone and took several photos of the symbol, making sure to capture it from multiple angles. Then I continued my circuit of the building, looking for other markings. I found 2 more, one near the rolling door, smaller and more degraded, another on the wall opposite the first, this one partially obscured by years of grime and rust staining. They all had the same basic design, circles with radiating lines, but the specifics varied slightly from one to another. Not identical, but related, like variations on a theme. Standing there in the moonlight, studying these strange symbols, I felt something shift in my understanding of the case. This wasn't random. Whatever was happening at this warehouse, it had been planned, prepared for. Those marks weren't just graffiti or random vandalism. They meant something, signified something. But what? I spent another hour examining the exterior of the building, taking photos and measurements, trying to document everything I could see. The whole time, I had the persistent feeling of being watched, though I never saw or heard anything that would confirm that sensation. Finally, I approached the personnel entrance. The padlock was exactly as I'd left it, hanging from the latch, securing nothing. I considered going inside, exploring the interior alone without all the lights and equipment the forensic team had brought. But something stopped me. Not fear, exactly, more like caution. An intuition that going inside right now alone would be a mistake I'd regret. So instead, I backed away from the door and returned to my vehicle. As I drove home through the quiet Miami streets, I couldn't shake the image of those symbols from my mind. They meant something. I just had to figure out what. The next morning, I went to see Dr. Patricia Holbrook, a professor of cultural anthropology at the University of Miami. Dr. Holbrook was one of several academic consultants the FBI occasionally worked with when cases touched on specialized knowledge outside our normal expertise. I showed her the photos I'd taken of the symbols, without providing much context about where I'd found them or why they were relevant to an ongoing investigation. She studied the images carefully, zooming in on details, comparing the 3 variations I'd documented. After several minutes, she looked up with an expression of professional interest. "These are fascinating," she said. "Where did you say you found them?" "I didn't," I replied. "Are you familiar with this type of marking?" "Not specifically," she admitted. "But the general style is reminiscent of several different symbolic traditions. The radiating lines could represent light, energy, influence expanding from a central point. Or they could represent the opposite, things converging toward a center. It's hard to say without more context. Could they be religious symbols? Occult markings?" Dr. Holbrook made a non-committal gesture. "Possibly. The circle and rays motif appears in dozens of different cultural and spiritual traditions. Solar worship, certain esoteric practices, even some modern neo-pagan movements, without knowing more about when these were created or by whom. I can't give you a definitive answer." "But they're intentional," I pressed. "Someone made these marks deliberately, with some specific purpose in mind." "Almost certainly," she agreed. "These aren't random graffiti or idle doodling. Whoever created them knew what they were doing. They chose specific locations, specific orientations. There's definitely meaning here. But you don't know what that meaning is." "Not without additional research," she said apologetically. "If you could give me more information about the context." "I can't," I said. "Not right now. But thank you for your time." I left Dr. Holbrook's office with more questions than answers. The symbols were intentional, meaningful, but their specific significance remained opaque. Just another piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. Over the next few days, I found myself increasingly obsessed with the warehouse case. I reviewed the footage dozens more times, analyzing every frame, looking for details I might have missed. I read through old reports about smuggling operations in the port of Miami, looking for patterns or connections. I even tracked down several retired agents who'd worked the docks before I joined the office, asking them if they'd ever encountered anything unusual in that area. Nobody had. Or if they had, they weren't willing to talk about it. Brennan noticed my obsession and tried to talk to me about it. "Reed, you need to let this go," he said during lunch one day. "Martinez and her team did a thorough investigation. They didn't find anything. Sometimes that's just how it is. You encounter something weird, you investigate it, you don't find an explanation. You move on." "I can't move on," I said. "Not when I know there's something there." "What makes you so sure?" "Because we heard some footsteps and saw some camera glitches." "Because I saw those symbols," I said, then immediately regretted it. I hadn't told Brennan about my unauthorized nighttime visit to the warehouse, hadn't mentioned what I'd found. "What symbols?" he asked, his expression sharpening. I told him about the markings I'd discovered, about my consultation with Dr. Holbrook. As I spoke, I could see the conflict on his face, the part of him that wanted to support his partner versus the part that thought I was crossing a line, becoming too invested in something that didn't add up to a real case. "You went back there alone?" he said when I finished. "Reed, that was incredibly stupid. What if something had happened to you?" "Nothing happened," I said. "I just looked around, took some photos, and found mysterious symbols that nobody else noticed during the forensic sweep. You realize how that sounds, right?" "I know how it sounds," I snapped. "But I'm not making this up. The symbols are real. They're there. Anyone can see them if they know where to look." Brennan was quiet for a moment, studying me. "I think you need to take some time off," he said finally. "You're burning yourself out on this thing." "I'm fine," I insisted, though I knew he was probably right. "You're not fine. You're obsessed, and obsession makes you sloppy, makes you see things that aren't there." "I'm not seeing things that aren't there." My voice was louder than I'd intended, drawing looks from other agents in the break room. Brennan held up his hands in a placating gesture. Okay, I believe you, but you need to step back from this, at least for a little while. Let it breathe. Maybe the answer will become clearer if you're not so focused on it." He was right, of course, but I couldn't let it go. Every night I found myself thinking about that warehouse, about the footsteps, and the shadows and the symbols on the walls. It was like a puzzle I couldn't solve, an itch I couldn't scratch. A week after my conversation with Dr. Holbrook, I got a call from our CI, the one who'd originally tipped us off about the warehouse. He'd been radio silent for almost 3 weeks, and I'd started to think he'd either skipped town or something had happened to him. "We need to meet," he said, his voice tense. "Tonight, alone." "What's this about?" I asked. "Not over the phone. Just meet me at the place we used last time, 9 o'clock. Come alone, or I walk." He hung up before I could agree or refuse. Our usual meeting spot was a 24-hour diner in Overtown, the kind of place where nobody paid attention to who was meeting with whom. I arrived 15 minutes early, as was my habit, and took a booth near the back where I could watch both the entrance and the street outside. The CI, whose name I knew but am not going to share here, showed up at 9:05, scanning the diner nervously before sliding into the booth across from me. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hands shaking slightly. You okay? I asked. No, he said bluntly. No, I'm not okay. I shouldn't have said anything about that place. I should have kept my mouth shut. What place? The warehouse? He glanced around, checking to make sure nobody was listening. Yeah, the warehouse. I've been hearing things, man. People asking questions about who might have talked to the feds. Did you give them any information about... Hell no. He cut me off. I'm not stupid, but they know someone talked. They're looking, and if they find out it was me... Who's they? I asked. Give me names, and I can protect you. He laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. You can't protect me from this. The FBI can't protect anyone from this. From what, exactly? Help me understand what we're dealing with. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know what it is. I just know it's bad. That warehouse, something happens there at night. People go in, but I've never seen anyone come out. Not in all the months I've been watching. What kind of people? Smugglers? Drug runners? I don't know what they are. I just see them going in, and then... He trailed off, shaking his head. Then what? Then nothing. They're just gone. Like the building swallowed them. A chill ran down my spine despite the warm air in the diner. Have you been inside? Are you crazy? No way. I wouldn't go in there for anything. He looked up at me, and I saw genuine fear in his eyes. You were there, right? You and your partner? You did surveillance? We did, I confirmed. Did you go inside? Briefly. And you came out okay? Yes, I said, though I was starting to wonder if that was entirely true. What exactly are you trying to tell me? He leaned forward, lowering his voice even further. I'm telling you to drop this case. Forget about that warehouse. Don't go back there. Just let it go. You know I can't do that. Then you're making a mistake, he said, standing up abruptly. I warned you. That's all I can do. Wait, I said. But he was already heading for the door, moving quickly through the diner without looking back. I considered following him, but something told me it would be pointless. He'd said what he came to say. Now he was done with this case, and apparently he thought I should be too. Driving home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what the CI had said. People going into the warehouse, but never coming out. It sounded absurd, like something from a bad horror movie. And yet, coming from someone who'd been genuinely terrified, it carried weight. When I got home, I pulled up the surveillance footage we'd captured again, this time looking for something specific. Any sign of people approaching or entering the warehouse during the hours we'd been watching. I went through every frame, every camera angle, every moment we'd recorded. Nothing. In all the hours of footage, not a single person approached that building. Just empty docks, shifting shadows, and those 3 seconds of unexplainable movement inside. But the CI had been adamant. He'd seen people going in, which meant either he was lying, mistaken, or what he'd witnessed had happened during hours we weren't watching. I needed to go back, not for a few hours of surveillance, but for an extended observation, multiple nights, around-the-clock coverage if possible. I needed to see what our CI had seen, needed to understand what was really happening at that warehouse. The problem was, I couldn't get authorization for that kind of operation based on what we had. No supervisor would approve the resources for an extended stakeout of a building that had already been thoroughly investigated and found to be empty. Which meant if I wanted to continue this investigation, I'd have to do it unofficially. On my own time, with my own equipment, outside the Bureau's knowledge or oversight. It was a bad idea for about a dozen different reasons. It violated protocol, potentially compromised the case, and could get me reprimanded or even fired if anyone found out. But I was going to do it anyway, because something was happening at that warehouse, something important, and I was the only one who seemed to recognize it. I began my unauthorized surveillance operation the following Friday night. I'd taken a personal day that Monday through Thursday, telling my supervisor I needed to deal with some family matters. In reality, I'd spent those days preparing, acquiring equipment from various sources that couldn't be traced back to the Bureau, mapping out optimal observation positions, planning my approach in meticulous detail. Brennan had noticed my absence, had sent several text messages asking if everything was okay. I'd kept my responses vague. Just need a few days, dealing with some personal stuff, nothing that would invite follow-up questions. The equipment I'd assembled was a mix of consumer-grade cameras and audio recorders, nothing as sophisticated as what the Bureau used, but good enough for my purposes. I also brought camping gear. I planned to stay at the warehouse for at least 48 hours straight, watching around the clock to see what our CI had seen. I arrived at the port around 9 p.m., parking in a different location than I'd used before. A public lot about half a mile from the warehouse. I didn't want my vehicle to be easily connected to the surveillance if anyone happened to notice it. The walk to the warehouse felt longer this time, weighed down as I was with equipment and supplies. The September heat had persisted into October, and I was drenched in sweat by the time I reached my chosen observation post. Not the same location Brennan and I had used, but a spot with better coverage of the warehouse's waterside entrance. I set up my cameras carefully, positioning them to cover all angles of approach to the building. Then I settled in to wait, prepared for a very long night. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I watched the warehouse through my binoculars, monitored the camera feeds on my tablet, and listened to the ambient sounds of the port through my audio equipment. Ships moved in the channel. Trucks rumbled past on distant roads. The usual symphony of industrial activity, gradually diminishing as the night deepened. Around 1 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. They started suddenly, without warning. That same measured pace I'd heard during our first surveillance, moving from one end of the warehouse to the other. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to have no beginning and no end, just an eternal loop of walking back and forth. I checked my cameras, looking for any sign of movement or heat signatures. Nothing. Just like before, the building appeared completely empty, even as the sound of footsteps continued. This time, I decided to document everything I was experiencing. I pulled out my personal voice recorder and began speaking into it, describing what I was hearing, what I was seeing, what I was feeling. If nothing else, this would serve as a record. Evidence that I wasn't losing my mind, that the phenomena I was documenting were real and consistent. It's 1:07 a.m., October 13th, I said quietly into the recorder. I'm hearing footsteps inside the warehouse again. Same pattern as before, slow, regular pace, moving from one end of the building to the other. No visible source. Thermal imaging shows no heat signatures inside the structure. Doors remain closed and secured from the outside. As I spoke, the footsteps suddenly stopped. Complete silence for maybe 5 seconds. Then they resumed, but faster now. More urgent. Instead of the measured walking pace, this sounded like someone running, hard footfalls on concrete, moving rapidly through the warehouse interior. Footsteps have changed, I continued recording. Now, running, fast-paced. Still no visual confirmation of anyone inside the building. The running continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I became aware of another sound. Very faint, almost subliminal. That humming I'd heard during our second surveillance operation. That low-frequency vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Hearing the humming sound again, I spoke into the recorder. Low frequency, rhythmic, can't pinpoint the source. The humming grew gradually louder. Not by much, but enough to be noticeable. It rose and fell in a slow pattern, like breathing, like waves, like the pulse of something vast and incomprehensible. And then I saw it. Through my binoculars, focused on the warehouse's main entrance, I saw a figure. It was standing just inside the rolling door, visible through the same gap Brennan and I had used to shine our flashlights into the interior. A dark silhouette, human-shaped, but somehow wrong in proportions that I couldn't quite define. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my tablet to check the camera feeds. The figure was there on camera too, not a trick of my eyes or the low light conditions. It was real, or at least real enough to be captured by electronics. Visual confirmation, I said into the recorder, my voice less steady now. Figure visible inside the warehouse near the main entrance. Approximately 6 feet tall, humanoid shape, not moving. I watched through the binoculars as the figure stood motionless. It wasn't looking in my direction. It seemed to be facing the interior of the warehouse, but I had the distinct impression that it knew I was there, that it was aware of being observed. The humming sound intensified, and the figure began to move. Not walking, something stranger than that. It seemed to glide across the floor without any visible motion of legs, drifting from one side of the visible interior to the other like smoke being pushed by a gentle breeze. Figure is moving, I recorded. Motion appears anomalous, no walking motion visible, seems to float or glide, still maintaining approximately human shape and size. As I watched, the figure moved out of my line of sight, disappearing deeper into the warehouse. The humming sound faded gradually, returning to that barely audible background frequency. I sat there for a long moment, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that there had to be an explanation. A person in dark clothing, some trick of the light, my tired mind filling in gaps with imagination. But I'd been doing this job too long to dismiss what I'd seen. That figure had been real, or as real as anything else in my experience, and its movement had been wrong in ways I couldn't fully articulate. I checked the time, 1:47 a.m. The night was still young. For the next 2 hours I maintained my watch on the warehouse, recording everything I observed. The humming sound continued at low volume, occasionally swelling louder, then fading again. Several times I heard what sounded like voices. Not words exactly, just vocal sounds, as if people were having a conversation somewhere inside the building, but too distant for me to make out what they were saying. At 3:52 a.m., the personnel entrance opened. I watched through my binoculars as the door swung slowly outward, moving with that same deliberate quality I'd noticed before. No one emerged. The doorway just gaped open, revealing darkness beyond. I waited, watching for any sign of movement. The door remained open for exactly 3 minutes. I timed it, then swung closed again with the same slow deliberation. Personnel entrance opened and closed on its own, I recorded. Duration approximately 3 minutes, no visible cause for the movement. At 4:15 a.m. I saw lights inside the warehouse. Not bright lights, just a faint glow, flickering and unsteady, like candlelight or the glow from a small fire. The light moved through the interior, visible through various gaps and openings in the structure, tracing a path that seemed to have no particular logic or purpose. I documented this too, speaking quietly into my recorder while taking photographs with my phone. The light continued for perhaps 5 minutes, then extinguished abruptly, leaving the warehouse dark once more. Dawn was still a few hours away. I was exhausted, running on adrenaline and coffee, but I couldn't stop now. Not when things were finally happening, when the warehouse was revealing its secrets. At 5:03 a.m., I heard sirens in the distance, police or emergency services somewhere in the port area. The sound seemed to agitate something. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and I heard what sounded like multiple sets of footsteps inside the warehouse, all moving at once in different directions. Through my binoculars, I could see shadows moving past the gaps in the rolling door. Multiple figures now, not just one. They moved with that same gliding quality, that wrongness of motion that made them seem not quite human despite their generally human shapes. Multiple figures now visible, I recorded, trying to keep my voice steady. At least 3, possibly more, all exhibiting the same anomalous movement patterns. The sirens faded as whatever emergency vehicle had been responding moved away from the port area. The humming decreased in volume, and the figures inside the warehouse slowed their movements. And then, for the first time all night, I heard something that sounded like an actual word. It came through my audio recording equipment, faint but distinct. Come. Just that single word, spoken in a voice that seemed to have no gender, no accent, no identifiable human characteristics. Just come, repeated 3 times with perfect spacing between repetitions. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to pack up my equipment and get away from this place. Whatever was happening here, it was beyond my ability to investigate or understand. I was in over my head, but I stayed. God help me, I stayed. Because I needed to see this through, needed to understand what I was dealing with. The sky began to lighten, imperceptibly in the east. Sunrise was still more than an hour away, but that pre-dawn grayness was starting to creep into the world, slowly diluting the darkness. As the light increased, the phenomena I'd been documenting began to decrease. The humming faded away entirely. The shadows inside the warehouse became still. The sense of presence, of something watching and waiting, gradually diminished. By 6:30 a.m., when the sun finally broke the horizon, the warehouse looked exactly as it always did. Just an empty building in an industrial landscape, notable only for its abandonment. I remained at my observation post until 8 a.m., when the port began to come alive with the day's activity. Workers arrived. Trucks began moving cargo. The whole area transformed from its nighttime state into something busy and mundane. Finally, I packed up my equipment and made my way back to my vehicle. The walk seemed shorter in daylight, less oppressive. I was exhausted, physically and mentally drained from the night's vigil, but I had what I'd come for: documentation. Hours of footage, audio recordings, written observations, evidence of what was happening at that warehouse, proof that I wasn't imagining things or falling victim to mass hysteria. The question now was, what was I going to do with this evidence? I couldn't submit it through official channels. My unauthorized surveillance operation had violated too many rules and regulations. Even if I could prove everything I'd documented was real, I'd likely face disciplinary action for how I'd obtained the evidence. But I also couldn't just sit on it, couldn't pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. Whatever was happening at that warehouse, it was significant. It needed to be investigated properly, by people with more resources and authority than I had. I drove home in a daze, barely aware of the morning traffic around me. When I finally pulled into my apartment's parking lot, I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to gather my thoughts. My phone buzzed, a text from Brennan. "Where are you? Called your apartment but no answer, starting to worry." I stared at the message, trying to decide how to respond. I couldn't tell him what I'd been doing, couldn't explain the night I'd just spent. Not yet. Not until I'd figured out what it all meant. "I'm fine," I texted back. "Just needed to clear my head. I'll be in the office Monday." His response came almost immediately. "We need to talk. Something's happened with the warehouse case." My heart rate spiked. What happened? Not over text? Meet me at Rusty's in an hour? Rusty's was a bar near the office where agents sometimes met after hours. It was neutral territory, private enough for sensitive conversations, but public enough to avoid suspicion. I'll be there, I texted back. I went up to my apartment, showered quickly, and changed into fresh clothes. Looking at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the person staring back. I looked haggard, older than my years, with dark circles under my eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. But there was something else in my reflection, too. A kind of intensity, a determination. I was committed to this case now, whatever the cost. At Rusty's, I found Brennan already waiting in a corner booth, nursing what looked like a whiskey despite the early hour. He looked almost as tired as I felt. "You look like hell," he said as I slid into the booth across from him. "Thanks, you're not exactly fresh yourself." He managed a weak smile. "Yeah, well, it's been a rough few days." He paused, studying me. "Where have you really been, Reed?" "I told you, don't bullshit me." He cut me off. "I know you weren't dealing with family matters. You were working the warehouse case, weren't you? The one we're supposed to have dropped." There was no point lying. "Yeah," I admitted, "I was." "Jesus Christ, Reed." He shook his head. "Do you know how much trouble you could be in? Unauthorized surveillance, falsifying leave requests." "I know," I said. "But I had to. Nobody else was taking it seriously." "And what did you find?" He asked the question like he already knew the answer would only make things worse. I told him, all of it. The extended surveillance, the figures I'd seen, the lights and sounds, and that single word spoken in an inhuman voice. As I spoke, I watched his expression shift from anger to concern to something that looked almost like fear. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You realize how this sounds, right?" he finally said. "I have documentation, hours of audio and video. You can review it yourself." "That's not the point," he interrupted. "The point is, you've become obsessed with something that doesn't make sense, that can't be explained by any rational framework. And now you're seeing things that—" "I'm not seeing things," I said, louder than I'd intended. The few other patrons in the bar glanced our way. I lowered my voice. "I'm not making this up. It's all real. It's all documented." "Okay," Brennan said in a placating tone. "Okay, let's say you're right. Let's say there's something genuinely strange happening at that warehouse. What do you want to do about it? You can't submit your evidence through official channels. You obtained it illegally. You can't continue investigating on your own. You'll get caught eventually, and then your career is over." "So what do you suggest?" I asked, hearing the bitterness in my own voice. "Just let it go? Pretend none of this happened?" "Maybe," he said. "Maybe that's exactly what you need to do." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Reed, I said something had happened with the warehouse case. That wasn't just a pretext to get you here. There's been a development." "What kind of development?" "The building's been sold. New owner took possession yesterday, paid cash for the whole thing. They're planning to demolish it within the month." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Who bought it?" "Shell Corporation, registered in the Caymans. We tried to trace it back to actual owners, but it's buried under so many layers of corporate structure that it would take months to unravel, if we could unravel it at all." "You're saying someone bought the warehouse specifically to tear it down, to eliminate whatever's there?" "I'm saying someone bought an old warehouse in the port of Miami," Brennan corrected. "Probably for legitimate development purposes. You're reading significance into it because you're convinced there's something sinister going on." But I could see in his eyes that he didn't entirely believe his own words. He knew something was off, too. even if he wasn't ready to admit it. "When are they starting demolition?" I asked. "Couple of weeks, maybe sooner. They're rushing the permits through." Which meant I had a very limited window if I wanted to investigate further. Once that building was destroyed, whatever secrets it held would be gone forever. "I need to get inside," I said. "One more time properly. I need to see what's actually in there." "Read, no. With or without you," I continued. "But I'd rather not do it alone." Brennan stared at me for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the decision. Finally, he sighed. "You're really going to do this, aren't you? Even if I tell you it's the stupidest, most career-destroying idea you've ever had? Yes. And nothing I say is going to change your mind? No." He finished his whiskey in one long swallow. "Then I guess I'm coming with you, because someone needs to be there to pull your ass out of the fire when this inevitably goes wrong." Despite everything, I felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said grimly. "This is probably going to end badly for both of us." We went back to the warehouse that night, not for surveillance this time, but for entry. We decided that if we were going to break multiple bureau regulations and possibly several laws, we might as well do it thoroughly. Our plan was simple. Get inside, document as much as we could as quickly as possible, get out. No extended surveillance, no waiting around to see what happened. Just a focused investigation of the interior space to determine once and for all what we were dealing with. We arrived at 11 p.m., parking in the same marina lot I'd used before. Both of us wore civilian clothes rather than our FBI gear. If we got caught, we wanted at least some deniability about acting in an official capacity. The walk to the warehouse was tense. Neither of us spoke much. Both of us focused on our surroundings, alert for any sign that we were being watched or followed. The port was quieter than usual that night. Fewer trucks moving, fewer workers visible in the lighted areas. When we reached the building, Brennan produced a set of bolt cutters from his bag. "Last chance to back out," he said quietly. "Not backing out," I replied. He nodded and cut through the chain securing the rolling door. The sound of metal parting seemed incredibly loud in the quiet night, and we both froze, listening for any reaction. Nothing. Together, we lifted the rolling door just high enough to slip underneath, then lowered it again behind us. I activated my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the warehouse interior. Empty, just as it had been during the forensic investigation, just as it had appeared through our cameras. Concrete floor, rusted equipment, scattered debris. No signs of occupancy, no indication of the phenomena we documented. But the air inside felt different, heavier, more oppressive, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. And there was a smell I hadn't noticed before, something I couldn't quite identify. Not unpleasant exactly, but foreign, out of place. "You're sure about this?" Brennan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sure," I said, though I wasn't. Not really. Every instinct was screaming at me to leave, to get out while we still could. We moved deeper into the warehouse, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Brennan pulled out his tablet and activated his body camera, recording everything. I did the same with my phone, documenting our progress. The warehouse seemed larger inside than it had appeared from the outside, the ceiling higher, the walls more distant. Probably just a trick of the darkness and the way our lights created pockets of visibility in the surrounding gloom, but it added to the general sense of wrongness. We found the marks I'd photographed, the symbols carved into the walls. In person, they were even more unsettling, each one seeming to pulse with a faint luminescence that I couldn't entirely attribute to reflections from our lights. "What are these?" Brennan asked, running his fingers over one of the carvings. "Dr. Holbrook couldn't identify them specifically," I said. but she was sure they were intentional, meaningful. Meaningful how? That's what we're here to find out. We continued our circuit of the interior, documenting everything. Near the back of the warehouse, we found something we'd missed during the forensic investigation. A hatch in the floor, maybe 3 feet square, partially covered by debris. Brennan and I looked at each other. "Well," he said, "that's new." Together, we cleared away the debris and examined the hatch. It was metal, rusted but still functional, with a simple latch mechanism. No lock, no obvious security measures. "Think we should open it?" Brennan asked. "We came here to investigate," I said. "So yeah, I think we should open it." He nodded and reached for the latch. It took some effort. The metal had seized up over years of disuse, but eventually it gave way with a screech that made us both wince. Brennan pulled the hatch open, revealing a ladder descending into darkness below. I shone my light down into the opening, but the beam seemed to be absorbed by the blackness, revealing nothing. "How deep do you think it goes?" Brennan asked. "Only one way to find out." I went first, climbing down the ladder slowly, testing each rung before putting my full weight on it. The metal was cold under my hands, slick with condensation or something worse. After about 20 feet, my boots touched solid ground, concrete from the feel of it. I stepped away from the ladder and swept my light around, trying to get my bearings. We were in a tunnel, maybe 7 feet high and 6 feet wide, running in both directions from the base of the ladder. The walls were concrete, old and weathered, with moisture seeping through in places. The air down here was even heavier than above, thick with that unidentifiable smell I'd noticed earlier. Brennan climbed down behind me, his face pale in the reflected light from our flashlights. "This wasn't on any building plans," he said. "Martinez's team should have found this." "Maybe they did," I suggested. "Maybe they were told not to report it." "That's paranoid thinking." "Is it?" I played my light down one direction of the tunnel, then the other. Someone wanted this warehouse bought and demolished quickly. Someone didn't want it investigated too thoroughly. Maybe someone made sure certain findings didn't make it into official reports. "You're talking about conspiracy theories," Brennan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm talking about what we're seeing," I corrected. A hidden tunnel beneath a supposedly empty warehouse. A building that exhibits phenomena we can't explain. Symbols carved into walls that nobody can identify. At what point does it stop being conspiracy theory and start being reality? He didn't have an answer for that. We chose a direction at random, left, and began walking. The tunnel continued for maybe 50 feet before opening into a larger chamber, roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet in diameter. And that's where we found them. The walls of the chamber were covered in the same symbols we'd seen upstairs, but here they were everywhere, overlapping and intertwining in complex patterns that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to writhe in our flashlight beams, creating the illusion of movement, though they were clearly static carvings. But it wasn't the symbols that made Brennan and me stop in our tracks. It was what lay in the center of the chamber. A circle had been drawn on the floor in something dark, paint, or rust, or blood. I couldn't tell. Within the circle were more symbols, arranged in concentric patterns that radiated from a central point. And at that central point, lying perfectly flat on the concrete, was a piece of paper. We approached cautiously, as if the paper might explode or vanish at any moment. When we got close enough to see clearly, I realized it was actually a photograph, old and faded, showing a group of people standing in front of this very warehouse. I picked it up carefully, studying the image. There were maybe a dozen people in the photo, all dressed in dark clothing, all staring directly at the camera with expressions that were difficult to read. Behind them, clearly visible on the warehouse wall, were the same symbols we'd been finding. "When was this taken?" Brennan asked, looking over my shoulder. "No date on it," I said. "But based on the clothing and the photo quality, I'd guess 1970s or early 80s. So, whatever's been happening here, it's been happening for decades. At least." I was about to examine the photo more closely when I heard it. That humming sound rising from somewhere below us. Not from this chamber, from somewhere deeper, as if there were more levels beneath the one we'd reached. Brennan heard it too. "Reed," he said, his voice tight. "I think we should leave. Right now." He was right. We'd found more than we'd bargained for, and every minute we stayed increased the risk of something going very wrong. But as we turned to head back toward the ladder, the humming intensified, and I felt something change in the air around us. A kind of pressure, building rapidly, making my ears pop and my chest feel tight. "Run," I said. We ran. Behind us, I could hear something. Not footsteps exactly, but something moving through the tunnel. Multiple somethings, keeping pace with us as we sprinted back toward the ladder. We reached it at the same time, and I practically shoved Brennan ahead of me. "Climb! Go!" He didn't argue, scrambling up the ladder with speed born of pure adrenaline. I followed immediately after, my hands slipping on the rungs, my lungs burning. Below us, something emerged into the space at the base of the ladder. I didn't look back, didn't want to see what it was, but I could feel its presence, could sense it watching us ascend. We burst through the hatch into the warehouse, both of us moving on instinct now rather than thought. The rolling door we'd entered through seemed impossibly far away, but we covered the distance in seconds that felt like hours. Brennan hit the door first, shoving it upward with strength I didn't know he had. We tumbled out into the night air, into the blessed normalcy of the industrial port, away from whatever had been in that tunnel. We didn't stop running until we reached the marina parking lot, where we both collapsed against my car, breathing hard, our hearts racing. "Did you see it?" Brennan gasped. "Did you see what was down there?" "No," I said, "and I don't want to." We sat there for several minutes, neither of us speaking, both of us trying to process what had just happened. Finally, Brennan pulled out his tablet. "The body cam footage," he said. "We got it all recorded. Whatever was down there, we have evidence now." But when he pulled up the files, his face fell. "What the hell? What is it?" "The footage from inside the warehouse, it's corrupted. All of it. I'm just getting digital noise and static." I checked my phone. Same thing. Hours of video completely unusable. Just fragments and distortions. Nothing that could be presented as evidence. "How is that possible?" Brennan said. "These are military-grade recording devices. They don't just fail like this." "I don't think they failed," I said quietly. "I think whatever's in that warehouse doesn't want to be documented." We drove back to my apartment in silence. What could we say? We'd found evidence of something inexplicable, something potentially dangerous, but we had no way to prove it. Our footage was corrupted. We'd conducted the investigation illegally, and in 2 weeks, the building would be demolished anyway, erasing whatever secrets it held. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that photograph, the one I'd left behind in my panic to escape. Those people standing in front of the warehouse surrounded by symbols. What had they been doing? What had they known? And more importantly, were they responsible for whatever was happening there now? I pulled up my computer and started searching through old news archives, looking for anything related to that warehouse or that area of the port. It took hours, but eventually I found something. A brief article from 1981 about a group of people who'd disappeared from Miami. 12 individuals, all last seen in the area of the eastern basin of the port of Miami. The investigation had gone nowhere, No bodies found, no evidence of foul play, just people who'd vanished without a trace. The article included a photo of the missing persons. It took me a moment to realize it was the same photo I'd found in the underground chamber. So those people hadn't been standing in front of the warehouse. They'd been standing in front of their final resting place. Or whatever had happened to them, because I was increasingly certain they hadn't simply disappeared. They'd gone into that warehouse, down into those tunnels, and they'd found something. Or something had found them. I wrote up everything that night, documenting our investigation in as much detail as I could remember. I knew I couldn't submit it officially, but I wanted a record to exist somewhere. If something happened to me, if I disappeared the way those 12 people had, maybe someone would find my notes and understand what I'd been investigating. The warehouse was demolished 3 weeks later, right on schedule. I watched from a distance as the wrecking equipment took it apart, reducing decades of secrets to rubble and dust. The demolition took less than a day. By sunset, there was nothing left but a cleared lot waiting for redevelopment. Whatever had been in those tunnels, whatever had been generating those phenomena, was now buried under tons of concrete and steel. Or maybe it had escaped, dispersed into the surrounding port area, free to continue whatever it had been doing in some new location. I don't know. And that's what keeps me up at night. Brennan and I never discussed what happened in the warehouse. By unspoken agreement, we let it drop, moved on to other cases, pretended that night had never happened. He eventually transferred to the Houston office, said he wanted a change of scenery, but I think the real reason was that he couldn't handle being reminded of what we'd seen. I stayed in Miami, still working cases, still doing the job, but I've never stopped thinking about that warehouse, about those tunnels, about the humming sound that seemed to come from somewhere impossibly deep beneath the city. And sometimes, late at night when the port is quiet, I think I can still hear it. That low-frequency vibration that speaks of something vast and patient, something that predates our presence in this city and will probably outlast it. The official file on the Miami Docks case remains open, marked as unsolved, insufficient evidence. The forensic reports make no mention of tunnels or underground chambers. Martinez's team either never found them or was instructed not to report them. Only 3 pieces of evidence remain: the corrupted video files that Brennan and I captured, the notes I wrote that night after our escape, and the memory of 3 seconds of warehouse footage that shows something moving in the darkness. Those 3 seconds are still there, archived in the Bureau's database. Sometimes I pull them up and watch them, frame by frame, trying to understand what we captured. But I never can. It remains inexplicable, impossible, beyond the boundaries of what I thought I understood about the world. And that, more than anything else, is what haunts me. Not the fear or the danger or even the mystery itself, but the certainty that there are things in this world, in this city, in the places we think we know, that operate by rules we don't comprehend and can't investigate. The warehouse is gone now. The lot has been paved over, converted into additional parking for the port. Ships come and go. Cargo moves through. Life continues. But I know what was there. I know what Brennan and I found in those tunnels. And I know that demolishing a building doesn't necessarily destroy what was inside it. It just moves somewhere else, somewhere new, somewhere it can wait, patient and inexorable, until someone else stumbles across it in the dark. This is the case I've never been able to close, the investigation that never concluded. The mystery that remains unsolved, not because we didn't find evidence, but because the evidence we found made no sense. And, to this day, when I drive past that lot where the warehouse used to stand, I can feel it, that sense of presence, that certainty that I'm being watched from somewhere I can't see. The symbols we found carved into those walls, I eventually learned what they represented. Not from Dr. Holbrook, but from a retired professor of esoteric studies I tracked down in New Orleans. He looked at my photographs and went pale. "These are convergence marks," he said, "used in certain very old practices to thin the boundary between spaces, between here and elsewhere." "What's elsewhere?" I asked. "I don't know," he admitted, "and I don't think anyone who's found out has come back to tell us." So that's my answer. That's what was happening at the Miami warehouse. A convergence point, a place where the normal rules of reality became permeable, where something from elsewhere could reach through. Those 12 people who disappeared in 1981, they didn't vanish. They went through. They crossed over into whatever lies on the other side of those convergence points. And the noises, the shadows, the phenomena we documented, those were signs of whatever exists over there, pressing against the boundary, testing it, waiting for a chance to cross in the other direction. The warehouse is gone, but the convergence point isn't. You can't demolish something that exists in more dimensions than the 3 we normally perceive. You can only hide it, bury it under concrete and steel and hope that's enough. But I don't think it is. I think someday someone will dig in that lot for some reason. Utility lines, foundation work, whatever. And they'll break through to those tunnels, and they'll find the chamber with its circles and symbols, and maybe they'll be smarter than Brennan and I were. Maybe they'll leave it alone, seal it back up, walk away. But probably not. Curiosity is a powerful force. The desire to understand, to explain, to solve mysteries. It's what makes us human. It's what drives investigation and discovery and progress. It's also what leads us into darkness we're not prepared for. I still work cases. I still do the job. But I'm more careful now, more aware that not everything can be investigated safely. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some doors should remain closed. The 3 seconds of footage remain in the archives. Someday, maybe decades from now, someone else will find them. They'll see that dark shape moving through the empty warehouse, and they'll wonder what it was. Maybe they'll be smart enough not to look for the answer. But probably not. Because that's the thing about investigators. About anyone drawn to unexplained phenomena. We can't help ourselves. We see a mystery, and we have to solve it. We find a locked door, and we have to know what's behind it. Even when everything inside us is screaming to walk away. Even when we know, deep down, that some things are meant to stay hidden. I learned that lesson in the Miami warehouse. But the cost of learning it was the loss of certainty, the loss of the comfortable belief that the world operates according to rules I understand. Now I know better. Now I know that beneath the surface of our ordered reality, there are spaces where different rules apply. Places where the impossible becomes mundane, where the inexplicable is simply the way things are. The warehouse case taught me that. And it's a lesson I can never unlearn. So I document what I found, I write these notes, and I hope that someday they'll be useful to someone. Maybe they'll prevent another agent from making the same mistakes I did. Maybe they'll serve as a warning about what lies beneath the industrial landscapes of our cities. Or maybe they'll just be filed away, ignored, dismissed as the ramblings of an agent who spent too much time staring into the darkness and saw things that weren't there. But they were there. I know they were, and somewhere, beneath that paved lot in the port of Miami, they still are. The air in Little Havana was different from the rest of Miami. Heavier somehow, thick with the smell of Cuban coffee and cigar smoke even at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday night. The neighborhood had its own rhythm, its own pulse that didn't sync up with the broader city around it. You could feel it in the way sound traveled down the narrow streets, bouncing off the colorful buildings and old storefronts in patterns that seemed almost musical. I'm Special Agent Tyler Reeves, FBI Miami Field Office. 7 years with the Bureau, 4 of them working South Florida cases. Most of my work involved financial crimes and fraud investigations, the kind of white-collar cases that kept you behind a desk more than in the field. But tonight was different. Tonight I was sitting in an unmarked sedan on Calle Ocho, watching the third-floor window of a crumbling apartment building, waiting for a fugitive who might not even be there. The case was straightforward on paper. Marcus Diaz, wanted on federal racketeering charges, had been on the run for 6 months. We'd tracked him through a dozen cities, always arriving a day or two after he'd moved on. Smart guy, careful, knew how to stay invisible. But 2 days ago, one of our informants had placed him at this address in Little Havana, holed up in an apartment that belonged to a distant cousin. That's what brought me here tonight, along with Agent Sofia Campos, a Cuban-American agent from our organized crime unit who knew Little Havana better than anyone else in the office. She'd grown up 3 blocks from here, still had family in the neighborhood. When I'd been assigned the lead on bringing in Diaz, she'd volunteered to assist specifically because of her local knowledge. "Third floor, apartment 3C, Sophia said from the passenger seat, checking her notes on her tablet. Diaz's cousin hasn't been seen at the apartment in 2 weeks, but neighbors report hearing movement inside. Lights on at odd hours, shadows moving past the windows. Could be Diaz, I said. Could be anyone. Could be, she agreed. But the timing matches. His cousin disappeared right around when our informant says Diaz showed up in Miami. The building we were watching was typical for this part of Little Havana. 3 stories of faded pink stucco with wrought iron balconies and cracked concrete steps leading to a central entrance. Built sometime in the 50s or 60s, it had probably been nice once. Now, it was just another aging structure in a neighborhood that had seen better days, home to recent immigrants and people who couldn't afford anywhere else. "What's the plan?" Sophia asked. "Wait until we see him, then call for backup and make entry." "That's the idea," I said. "Though I'd prefer to actually confirm he's in there before we kick down any doors. Last thing we need is to storm the wrong apartment and scare the hell out of some grandmother who has nothing to do with this." "Agreed," Sophia said. She had her service weapon holstered at her hip, her FBI credentials hanging from a lanyard around her neck. Like me, she was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, and a dark jacket to avoid drawing attention. We'd been parked here for 2 hours already, and the last thing we wanted was for someone to notice us and tip off Diaz. The street was relatively quiet for a Tuesday night in Little Havana. A few cars passed occasionally, salsa music drifted from an open window somewhere nearby, and I could see an older man sitting on a first-floor balcony, smoking and watching the street with the patient vigilance of someone who'd lived here long enough to know everyone's business. "Think that guy has noticed us?" I asked, nodding toward the man on the balcony. Sophia glanced over. "Definitely. But he probably sees suspicious cars on this street all the time. Drug dealers, immigration enforcement, whoever. As long as we don't do anything obviously threatening, he'll just keep watching." At 10:47 p.m., the lights in apartment 3C flickered. Not like someone turning them on and off deliberately, but the kind of brief power interruption you might see during a storm. The lights dimmed, went out completely for maybe 2 seconds, then came back on. "You see that?" I asked. "Yeah," Sophia said, leaning forward to get a better view. "Could be electrical problems. This building's old enough that the wiring is probably shot. Or someone inside playing with switches," I suggested. We watched for several more minutes, but the lights remained steady. No shadows moved past the windows. No sign of anyone inside. At 11:15 p.m. it happened again. The lights in 3C flickered and died. This time, staying dark for maybe 5 seconds before returning. And this time, I caught a glimpse of something. a brief silhouette against the curtained window, visible for just a moment before the lights came back. "There," I said, pointing. "Someone's definitely in there." Sophia nodded, already reaching for her radio to call it in. "This is Agent Campos. We have visual confirmation of movement in the target apartment, requesting backup for entry." The response came back almost immediately. Backup was at least 20 minutes out. A multi-vehicle accident on the Palmetto Expressway had traffic snarled across half the city, and the nearest available units were stuck in it. "Copy that," Sophia said into the radio. "We'll maintain visual until backup arrives." But 20 minutes was a long time. Long enough for Diaz to realize he'd been spotted. Long enough for him to escape out a back exit or a fire escape we hadn't covered. I looked at Sophia, reading the same calculation in her expression. "We could do a soft approach," I suggested. "Just knock on the door, talk to whoever's inside, confirm identity before backup arrives." "That's not protocol," Sophia said, but her tone suggested she was considering it anyway. "Protocol assumes we have backup readily available," I countered. "Right now, we have a fugitive who might be in that apartment, and a 20-minute window for him to disappear again. I'm not saying we go in hard, just knock, identify ourselves, see if we can keep him contained until the cavalry shows up." Sophia thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, but we stay in the hallway. No entering the apartment no matter what. We identify him, we keep him talking, we wait for backup to actually make the arrest." "Agreed," I said, checking my weapon and body camera. "Let's go have a conversation." We exited the vehicle and crossed the street, moving with purpose but not urgency. No need to look like we were raiding the place. To any watching neighbors, we could just be visiting friends. Nothing unusual. The building's entrance was unlocked. Not surprising in a place like this, where residents were constantly coming and going and a broken door lock probably wasn't high on the landlord's priority list. We entered a dim lobby that smelled of mildew and old cooking oil, with a staircase leading up and a row of battered mailboxes on one wall. "Third floor," I said quietly, and we started climbing. The stairs creaked under our feet, the sound echoing in the confined space. Somewhere above us, I could hear a television playing loudly, the rapid-fire Spanish of a telenovela filtering through a thin door. On the second-floor landing, a cat darted past us and disappeared down a hallway. When we reached the third floor, we found ourselves in a corridor lit by a single flickering fluorescent light. 4 apartment doors faced us, including 3C at the far end. The hallway was narrow, claustrophobic, with peeling wallpaper and a carpet that had probably been brown once, but was now an indeterminate shade of gray. As we approached 3C, the overhead light flickered more intensely, dimming almost to darkness before brightening again. I glanced at Sophia, who shrugged. Old building, old electrical system. The door to 3C was painted a faded blue, the number barely visible where the metallic 3 and C had tarnished over time. No sounds came from inside, no light visible under the door or through the peephole. I positioned myself to one side of the door, standard procedure, staying out of the direct line of fire in case things went wrong, while Sophia took the other side. Then I knocked, 3 firm raps that echoed down the hallway. "FBI," I called out. "We need to speak with whoever's inside." No response. I waited 10 seconds, then knocked again. "Federal agents. We know someone's in there. Open the door, please." Still nothing. But I could hear something now, very faint. A kind of rustling sound like papers being moved or fabric dragging across floor. Someone was definitely inside, trying to be quiet. Sophia and I exchanged looks. She mouthed the word warrant, and I shook my head. We didn't have one yet, hadn't needed one for a simple surveillance operation. Without a warrant or probable cause of an immediate crime in progress, we couldn't legally force entry. "Mr. Diaz," I called through the door, taking a calculated risk on using his name. "We just want to talk. Nobody needs to get arrested tonight if you're willing to cooperate." The rustling sound stopped. Silence for maybe 5 seconds. Then, unexpectedly, I heard breathing, not from inside the apartment, from right on the other side of the door, as if someone were standing there, pressed against the wood, listening to us just as we were listening to them. It was heavy breathing, labored, like someone who'd been running or was in some kind of distress. In and out, steady but strained, so close I could almost feel it through the door. "Sir," Sophia said, her hand moving instinctively toward her weapon, "we can hear you. Please open the door so we can talk." The breathing continued for another moment, then stopped abruptly. Footsteps, definitely footsteps now, moving away from the door, deeper into the apartment. "He's running," I said. "Back door or window." But before I could finish, the overhead light in the hallway went out completely, plunging us into darkness. Not flickering this time, just suddenly dead, as if someone had flipped a breaker. "Power's out," Sophia said, pulling out her flashlight. I did the same, and our 2 beams cut through the darkness of the hallway. The light from our flashlights seemed weaker somehow, less effective than it should have been, as if the darkness were actively resisting illumination. "We need to check if he's leaving through another exit," I said, already moving back toward the stairs. "You stay here, watch the door. I'll cover the back of the building." "Tyler," Sophia started, but I was already moving. I made my way back down the stairs, using my flashlight to navigate the now dark stairwell. The power outage had affected the entire building. I could hear confused voices from behind closed doors, people calling out in Spanish, asking what had happened. I exited through the back of the building into a small courtyard area enclosed by a chain-link fence. Several windows overlooked the courtyard, and there was a rusted fire escape that provided access to the upper floors. I trained my flashlight on the fire escape, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. No one climbing down, no indication that anyone had recently used the metal structure. But as I stood there in the darkness of the courtyard, I became aware of a sound. It took me a moment to place it, a low humming, almost below the threshold of conscious hearing. Not mechanical, not environmental. Something else. I keyed my radio. "Sophia, you hearing anything unusual up there?" Her response was immediate, but the audio was wrong. Her voice kept cutting in and out, overlaid with static that made it hard to understand. "Hearing, thing, stairs. Say again, you're breaking up. Something on the back. Careful." The radio went completely silent after that, not even static. I tried transmitting again but got no response. Communication was down, which meant either the equipment was malfunctioning or something was interfering with our signal. I made my way back inside and up the stairs, moving more cautiously now. The darkness felt oppressive in a way that went beyond the simple absence of light. It was thick, almost tangible, like moving through deep water. When I reached the 3rd floor, I found Sophia exactly where I'd left her, standing beside the door to 3C, with her flashlight pointed at the entrance. But something was wrong with her posture. She was standing too still, too rigid, like a statue. "Sophia?" I called quietly. She didn't respond, didn't turn to look at me, just kept standing there, flashlight beam unwavering on the door. I approached carefully, one hand on my weapon. "Sophia, you okay?" Finally, she turned her head toward me, and I saw her face in the reflected light from our flashlights. Her expression was confused, disoriented, like someone who'd just woken from a deep sleep. "Tyler?" she said, her voice uncertain. "When did you get back?" "Just now. I've been gone maybe 3 minutes." 3 minutes? She checked her watch, then looked at me with genuine surprise. "It's been almost 15 minutes. I've been standing here for 15 minutes. That didn't make sense." I'd gone downstairs, checked the courtyard, come back up. Couldn't have been more than 5 minutes total. But Sophia's watch showed 11:47 p.m. and mine showed the same time. Somehow, we'd lost 10 minutes somewhere in that sequence. "Did anything happen while I was gone?" I asked. She frowned, clearly trying to remember. "I was watching the door, the lights were out, and then, I don't know, it's like I blinked and suddenly you were back. But I didn't blink. I was standing here the whole time, I think." Before I could respond, we both heard it. That breathing sound again, coming from inside the apartment. Heavy, labored, right on the other side of the door. Except, this time it was accompanied by words, whispered so quietly I almost couldn't make them out. "Come back, come back, come back." Just those 2 words, repeated in a voice that sounded wrong somehow. Too flat, too emotionless, like a recording playing through damaged speakers. Sophia and I looked at each other. "That's not Diaz," she said quietly. "No," I agreed. "I don't think it is." The breathing and whispering continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped as abruptly as it had started. The silence that followed was somehow worse, heavy with anticipation of something we couldn't name. Then the power came back on. The hallway lights flickered twice before stabilizing, revealing the corridor in all its shabby glory. And the door to apartment 3C, the door we'd been watching, the door that had been closed and locked, was now standing slightly ajar, open maybe 6 inches, darkness visible beyond. Neither of us had heard it open. Neither of us had seen it move. It had just changed states, from closed to open, as if the building itself had decided to invite us inside. "We should wait for backup," Sophia said, though I could hear in her voice that she knew waiting wasn't really an option anymore. Whatever was happening here had moved beyond a simple fugitive apprehension. This was something else entirely. I activated my body camera, making sure it was recording, then pushed the door open wider with my foot while keeping my weapon drawn. The hinges creaked, a sound that seemed too loud in the renewed silence of the hallway. "FBI," I announced. "We're coming in." The apartment was dark except for the light spilling in from the hallway. I swept my flashlight across the interior, revealing a small living room area sparsely furnished with a sagging couch and a TV on a plastic stand. Beyond that, I could see a kitchenette with a few dirty dishes in the sink and a short hallway that presumably led to a bedroom and bathroom. Everything looked normal. Poor, neglected, but normal. Nothing obviously wrong or threatening. Except for the fact that the apartment was completely empty. No Diaz, no cousin, no one at all. Just furniture and shadows. "Clear left," Sophia said, checking the kitchen area while I covered her. "Clear right," I confirmed, moving toward the hallway. The bedroom was small and cramped, with an unmade bed and clothes scattered on the floor. The bathroom was empty, the shower curtain pulled back to reveal a rust-stained tub. No one hiding, no sign of anyone having been there recently. We'd heard someone inside this apartment. We'd heard breathing, footsteps, words, but there was no one here. No open windows, no back exit. The only way out was the door we'd come through, and we'd been watching it the entire time. "How is this possible?" Sophia asked, voicing the question we were both thinking. "I don't know," I admitted. "Could they have left before we got here? Used the power outage to slip past us in the dark?" "We would have seen them on the stairs," Sophia pointed out. "And you were covering the back. Where could they have gone?" I had no answer for that. We documented the apartment thoroughly, checked every possible hiding spot, and found nothing. Whoever, or whatever, we'd heard was gone, vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. My radio crackled to life suddenly, making us both jump. Agents Reeves and Campos, this is dispatch. Backup units are arriving at your location. Status report, please. Sophia keyed her radio. We're in apartment 3C. The apartment is clear, no sign of the suspect. Building experienced a power outage approximately 20 minutes ago, now resolved. Recommend we maintain position until backup arrives for a complete sweep. Copy that. Units are entering the building now. Within minutes, 4 more agents had joined us on the 3rd floor, along with 2 Miami PD officers who'd responded to assist. We conducted a thorough search of the entire building. Every apartment, every storage space, every possible exit. We interviewed neighbors, checked security footage from nearby businesses, did everything by the book. Marcus Diaz was not in the building. According to residents we spoke with, no one matching his description had been seen in the area. The apartment's actual tenant, Diaz's cousin, had indeed disappeared 2 weeks ago, but neighbors assumed he'd just moved out without notice, something that happened frequently in the building. As for the phenomena Sophia and I had experienced, the breathing, the whispered words, the power outage, the lost time, none of it showed up in our recordings. My body camera had captured footage of us approaching the apartment, knocking on the door, but the audio was corrupted with static. The moments when we'd heard the breathing and whispering were just white noise and distortion on the recording. By 2 a.m., we'd exhausted all leads. The supervising agent who'd come to oversee the operation authorized us to clear the scene, mark the case as active but cold, and head home. We'd file our reports in the morning. As Sophia and I walked back to our vehicle, she said quietly, "We both experienced the same things in there. The breathing, the voice, the lost time. That can't all be coincidence." "No," I agreed, "it can't." So, what was it? I didn't have an answer. And as we drove away from Little Havana back toward our respective homes, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd missed something important. Something that had been right in front of us the entire time, hidden in plain sight by the very strangeness of the events themselves. It was only later, reviewing my notes before trying to sleep, that I realized what had been bothering me. The whispered words we'd heard through the door, "Come back, come back." They hadn't been an instruction or a plea. They'd been a warning. I spent the next 3 days trying to write a coherent report about what had happened at the Little Havana apartment. The problem was, every time I sat down to document the events, they seemed to slip away from me, details becoming fuzzy and inconsistent. I'd remember hearing the breathing clearly, then question whether it had really been as distinct as I thought. I'd recall the door standing open, then wonder if maybe we'd pushed it open ourselves and simply forgotten in the confusion. It was like trying to remember a dream. The harder I focused on the specifics, the more they dissolved into uncertainty. Sophia was having the same problem. We met for coffee on Friday morning to compare notes, and I could see the frustration in her eyes as she scrolled through her tablet. "I wrote 4 different versions of this report," she said. "And they all sound insane. Lost time, mysterious voices, doors opening by themselves. No supervising agent is going to sign off on this. They're going to think we made it up, or that we're both having some kind of shared delusion." "So, what do we put in the official report?" I asked. "The facts. Subject was not at the location. Building experienced a power outage. Surveillance was compromised. Case remains open." She set down her tablet and looked at me. "Everything else, the weird stuff, we leave out. Chalk it up to stress and fatigue and move on." It made sense from a career perspective. No point in torpedoing our credibility over events we couldn't explain or even describe properly. But it felt wrong somehow, like we were abandoning something important. "Have you thought about going back?" I asked. "To the apartment, I mean, just to see if anything else happens." Sophia gave me a sharp look. "Why would we do that? The case is cold. Diaz isn't there. There's no operational reason to return. Except that something happened in that building. Something we don't understand. And investigating things we don't understand isn't our job," Sophia said firmly. "Our job is finding fugitives and building cases for prosecution. Strange experiences during a failed stakeout don't fall under bureau jurisdiction." She was right, of course, and yet I couldn't let it go. That night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, I kept thinking about the apartment, about the breathing we'd heard, the whispered words, the door standing open when it should have been closed, about Sophia's missing 15 minutes and the corrupted audio on our body cameras. Something had happened there. Something real, even if we couldn't properly document it. And the only way to understand it was to go back. Saturday evening, I found myself driving back to Calle Ocho, not in an official capacity. I'd left my FBI credentials and service weapon at home, brought only my personal phone and a flashlight. This wasn't bureau business. This was personal curiosity, perhaps bordering on obsession. The neighborhood looked different in daylight, less atmospheric but also more clearly struggling. I could see the poverty that the night had partially hidden, the cracked sidewalks, the closed storefronts with faded signs, the people sitting on stoops who watched me pass with expressions that ranged from curious to suspicious. I parked in front of the building and sat for a moment, studying the structure. In the evening light, it looked almost benign, just another aging apartment building in a neighborhood full of them. The pink stucco was more faded than I'd realized, and several of the balconies had plants growing in makeshift planters, adding touches of green and color to the weathered facade. The man I'd seen smoking on the first-floor balcony during our stakeout was there again, watching the street with the same patient attention. As I got out of my car, his eyes tracked me, noting but not commenting on my presence. I approached the building's entrance, half expecting to find it locked in the daytime. But the door was open, as it had been before, and I entered the dim lobby without difficulty. The smell of cooking, plantains and pork, filled the air, mixing with the underlying scent of mildew. The stairs creaked the same way they had before, and I found myself moving more slowly this time, paying attention to details I'd missed during the urgency of our initial approach. The wallpaper on the stairwell was a pattern of faded flowers, probably installed decades ago and never replaced. Some of the steps had worn grooves where generations of residents had climbed up and down, their footfalls slowly eroding the wood. When I reached the third floor, the hallway was bright with afternoon sun streaming through a window at the far end. The fluorescent fixture that had flickered so dramatically during our visit was off now, unnecessary in the natural light. Apartment 3C looked exactly as I remembered it. Same faded blue door, same tarnished numbers, but something felt different, though I couldn't quite say what. Just a sense that the space was somehow more present, more aware than it had any right to be. I knocked on the door, not really expecting an answer. The sound echoed down the hallway and I waited, listening for any sign of occupancy. Nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no whispered words. Just the distant sounds of the building, televisions playing, children's voices from somewhere below, the hum of air conditioning units straining against the Miami heat. I tried the doorknob, not surprised to find it locked. Without a warrant or probable cause, I had no legal right to enter, even if I'd wanted to. This was as far as I could go. But as I stood there, hand still on the knob, I felt something. Not a physical sensation exactly, more like a presence, a sense of being observed from the other side of the door. The same feeling I'd had during our stakeout, amplified now by the knowledge that the apartment was supposedly empty. "Is someone there?" I asked quietly, feeling foolish even as the words left my mouth. No response, of course. Just that persistent sense of presence, of something on the other side of the door paying attention to me with an intensity that felt almost physical. I was about to turn away when I heard it, so faint I almost missed it. That same whispered voice, "Come back." The words were barely audible. Could have been imagination, or the building's pipes or air moving through the walls. But I'd heard them, or thought I'd heard them. The certainty was hard to maintain. I pulled out my phone and checked the audio recording app I'd started when I entered the building. The waveform showed some activity, but when I played it back, there was nothing but the ambient noise of the building. Whatever I'd heard hadn't been captured electronically. "Excuse me." I spun around to find an elderly woman standing in the hallway behind me. She must have emerged from one of the other apartments while I'd been focused on 3C. She was small and thin, dressed in a housecoat despite the heat, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Can I help you?" she asked in accented English, her tone more curious than suspicious. I was looking for the person who lives here," I said, gesturing at 3C. "Do you know if anyone's home?" The woman's expression shifted to something that looked almost like pity. "No one lives there now. The young man who rented it, Luis, I think his name was, he left some weeks ago, never came back. Did you know him well?" She shook her head. "No, he kept to himself, never caused trouble. But I heard things from that apartment sometimes. Voices, even when he should have been at work. And sometimes—" She paused, seeming to reconsider what she was about to say. "Sometimes what?" I prompted gently. "Sometimes the lights would be on in the middle of the night, and I would hear him talking, not on the phone, talking to someone who was there with him. But when I saw him in the hallway, he was always alone. Do you remember when this started?" She thought for a moment. "Maybe 3, 4 months ago? It was around the time the electrician came to fix the wiring. The power had been going out in the building for weeks, and the landlord finally called someone. After that, Luis started acting strange." This was more information than I'd expected. "Do you know which electrician? Which company?" "I don't remember the name, but he was here for several days, working in the basement and in some of the apartments, including that one." She pointed at 3C. "He told some of us he found old wiring, very dangerous, that it could have caused a fire." "Thank you," I said. "That's very helpful." The woman nodded, but before leaving, she said something that made my skin prickle. "My advice? Stay away from that apartment. Some places remember things, some places don't want to be empty." She shuffled back to her apartment, 3A, directly across from 3C, and closed the door, leaving me alone in the hallway again. I stood there for several more minutes, processing what she'd told me. An electrician working on the building. Problems with the wiring starting 3 or 4 months ago. Luis acting strangely after that, then disappearing 2 weeks ago. And now we'd come here chasing a fugitive who'd supposedly been staying with Luis, only to find an empty apartment and experience phenomena we couldn't explain. I pulled out my phone and called Sophia. She answered on the 3rd ring, and I could hear traffic noise in the background. "Please tell me you're not at that apartment," she said without preamble. "I'm at the building," I admitted. "Not inside the apartment. Just talking to neighbors, getting background. Tyler, we agreed to let this go. You agreed to let it go. I never did." I quickly filled her in on what the neighbor had told me. "Something happened here a few months ago, something connected to electrical work, and it's been affecting the building ever since." Sophia was quiet for a moment. "You know how paranoid that sounds, right? You're suggesting that an electrician did something to this building that's causing supernatural phenomena?" I'm not suggesting anything supernatural, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. I'm saying there's a pattern here. Problems with the electricity, strange experiences, people disappearing. That's worth investigating. Not through unofficial channels, Sophia said firmly. If you want to pursue this, do it properly. File a request for a follow-up investigation, get authorization, work it as an official case, and say what in the request. I heard a spooky voice and want to chase ghosts? You say there's a pattern of suspicious disappearances connected to this location, Sophia said. That's legitimate. Luis disappeared. Diaz supposedly came here, and now we can't find him. That's 2 missing persons. Frame it that way, and you might get approval. She was right. I needed to work within the system, not around it. Going off on unauthorized solo investigations was a good way to end my career. Okay, I said. I'll file the request Monday morning. But in the meantime, can you do me a favor? Check if there have been any other missing persons reports connected to this building or this block. I can do that, Sophia agreed. But Tyler, be careful. I don't know what we encountered in that apartment, but my instinct says it's something we shouldn't poke too hard. After we hung up, I took one more look at the door to 3C. In the afternoon light, it looked completely ordinary. Just a door, slightly shabby but unremarkable. But I knew better now. There was something on the other side of that door, something that waited in the darkness and whispered to people who got too close. Something connected to the building's electrical system, perhaps, or to whatever the electrician had done during his repairs. I needed to find that electrician, needed to understand what he'd discovered in the walls and under the floors. Because I was increasingly certain that the answer to what was happening in apartment 3C lay somewhere in the building's infrastructure, in the hidden spaces behind the walls where old wiring snaked through the structure like veins carrying something other than electricity. As I left the building and walked back to my car, I glanced up at the third-floor windows. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the facade. And for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a silhouette standing in one of the windows of 3C, watching me leave. But when I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. Just curtains and the reflection of the dying light. I drove back to my apartment with the feeling that I'd just committed to something I didn't fully understand. This was no longer just about finding Marcus Diaz or solving a cold case. This was about understanding what was happening in that building, what force or phenomenon or whatever it was had taken up residence there and was reaching out to anyone who came too close. And despite every rational instinct telling me to walk away, to let someone else handle this, I knew I couldn't. I'd heard that voice calling me back. I'd felt that presence waiting on the other side of the door. Whatever was in apartment 3C had noticed me. And I had the distinct impression that it wasn't going to let me leave it alone now. Monday morning, I submitted my request for a follow-up investigation into the Little Havana apartment building. I framed it exactly as Sophia had suggested, as a missing persons inquiry, focused on the pattern of disappearances rather than the unexplainable phenomena. 2 people connected to that location had vanished without trace. That was enough to justify further investigation, regardless of what else might be happening. The request sat on my supervisor's desk for 2 days before I got called into his office. Special Agent in Charge Marcus Brenner was a 20-year Bureau veteran, methodical and by the book. He'd risen through the ranks by avoiding controversy and maintaining a perfect clearance rate on his cases. He was not the kind of supervisor who encouraged agents to chase unusual theories. "This request," he said, tapping the file on his desk. "The Little Havana follow-up. Walk me through your reasoning." I'd prepared for this. 2 individuals with known connections to apartment 3C at 847 Calle Ocho have disappeared within a 3-week period. Luis Moreno, the apartment's renter, hasn't been seen since October 1st. Marcus Diaz, wanted on federal racketeering charges, was placed at that location by a credible informant and has since vanished. Both disappearances are uncharacteristic. Moreno left personal belongings in the apartment, and Diaz was actively using the location as a hideout. Something caused both men to leave suddenly and completely. You think they're connected? The disappearances? I think the location is significant, I said carefully. There may be something about that apartment or that building that's relevant to both cases. Brenner studied me for a moment. Agent Campos noted in her report that you and she experienced equipment malfunctions during your surveillance. Body camera audio corrupted, radio communication failures. You think that's related? Possibly. The building has a history of electrical problems. That might account for the equipment issues. Or it might just be old equipment and operator error, Brenner said dryly. But he didn't reject the request outright. I'll authorize a follow-up, but limited scope. You have 3 days. Find something concrete connecting these disappearances to that location, or we close the case and move on. Understood? Understood, I said. Thank you, sir. With official authorization in hand, I started by tracking down the electrician who'd worked on the building 4 months earlier. It took most of Monday afternoon, but I eventually found a work order filed with the city's building department. Repairs to Building 847, Calle Ocho, conducted by Martinez Electrical Services, contracted by the building's owner. I called the company and spoke with the owner, Carlos Martinez. He remembered the job immediately. That building on Calle Ocho? Yeah, I remember. Worst electrical system I've seen in 30 years of doing this work. Original wiring from the 1960s, aluminum instead of copper, improper grounding throughout. I told the owner it all needed to be replaced, but he only wanted me to fix the immediate problems. What were the immediate problems? I asked. Power outages mostly. Lights flickering. Circuits breaker tripping constantly. But when I got in there to investigate, I found something strange. Strange how? Carlos hesitated. This is going to sound crazy, but I swear it's true. The wiring in that building, it was configured in ways that didn't make sense. Like someone had rewired sections of it deliberately wrong, creating loops and feedback patterns that shouldn't exist in a normal electrical system. Could it have been a mistake? Original installation error? No way. This was intentional. Someone who knew what they were doing had modified the wiring probably decades ago. And the really weird part? The modifications were all centered around the 3rd floor, specifically around one apartment. My pulse quickened. Apartment 3C? Yeah, that was it. How'd you know? Lucky guess. Did you fix the problem? I tried, Carlos said. But when I started disconnecting the modified wiring, things got strange. The building's power would surge whenever I touched certain connections, and I kept hearing things while I was working in the walls. Voices, almost. Just beyond the threshold of hearing. Did you report any of this? To who? The building owner just wanted the lights to stay on. He didn't care about mysterious voices in the walls. Carlos paused. Look, I did the best I could with what I was authorized to do. I fixed the immediate safety issues and stabilized the power supply. But that building's electrical system is still wrong in ways I can't fully explain. My advice? Stay away from apartment 3C specifically. Whatever's going on there, it's not just an electrical problem. After thanking Carlos for his time, I sat in my car and reviewed my notes. The pieces were starting to come together, though the picture they formed was disturbing. Someone, decades ago, had deliberately modified the building's wiring in ways that created feedback loops and unusual electrical patterns. The modifications were centered on apartment 3C, and anyone who spent time in that apartment, Luis, potentially Diaz, maybe others, eventually disappeared. I needed to get into that apartment again, this time with proper equipment to measure electrical activity and document whatever was happening there. But I also needed backup, someone who understood electrical systems better than I did. Sophia was busy with another case, but she helped me arrange access to one of the Bureau's technical specialists, a guy named David Park, who normally worked on electronic surveillance and wiretapping, but had a background in electrical engineering. He agreed to meet me at the building Tuesday evening. We arrived at 847 Calle Ocho, just as the sun was setting, the street lights beginning to flicker on along the block. David had brought several pieces of equipment, an oscilloscope to measure electrical signals, an EMF detector to pick up electromagnetic fields, and various other tools I didn't fully understand. "What exactly are we looking for?" David asked as we climbed the stairs to the third floor. "Anomalies," I said. "Unusual electrical patterns. Anything that might explain why people who spend time in this apartment tend to disappear." "People disappear because of electrical patterns?" David raised an eyebrow. "That's a new one." "Just trust me," I said, "and document everything you find." The door to 3C was still locked, but I'd brought the building owner's permission and a key this time. Everything legal and by the book. The apartment looked exactly as it had during our first visit. Sparse furniture, signs of recent but not current occupancy. Nothing obviously wrong. David began setting up his equipment, starting with the oscilloscope connected to a wall outlet. Almost immediately, his expression changed. "That's weird," he muttered, adjusting the device's settings. "The waveform is all wrong." "Wrong how?" "AC power should have a clean sine wave at 60 Hz. This is... I don't even know what this is. Multiple frequencies overlapping, creating interference patterns I've never seen in residential wiring." He moved the oscilloscope to different outlets throughout the apartment, getting similar results each time. "It's like the electrical system is oscillating at multiple frequencies simultaneously. That shouldn't be possible with standard wiring." "Could it be dangerous?" I asked. "Potentially. These kinds of interference patterns could damage electronics, maybe even affect biological systems if the exposure is prolonged." David pulled out the EMF detector and began sweeping it around the room. The device immediately began beeping, its readings spiking into the red zone. "Okay, that's definitely not normal. The electromagnetic field strength in here is about 10 times higher than typical residential levels, and it's not uniform, it's concentrated in certain areas." He followed the EMF readings, moving through the apartment like he was tracking a scent. The readings were highest near the corners of each room and along certain walls. When he reached the bedroom, the detector went crazy, the readings maxing out completely. "There's something behind this wall," David said, tapping the surface. "Something generating a massive electromagnetic field." I helped him move the bed aside, revealing an access panel low on the wall. It was painted over but still visible if you knew what to look for. Using a screwdriver from his toolkit, David pried the panel open. Behind it was a junction box, but not like any I'd ever seen. The wiring inside was incredibly complex, with cables running in precise geometric patterns that seemed more like circuitry than conventional electrical work. And at the center of the pattern was something that looked almost like a transformer or a capacitor, a custom-built component that didn't belong in residential wiring. "What is that?" I asked. "I have no idea," David admitted. "But it's definitely custom-made, and it's connected to the building's power supply. Whatever it's doing, it's using electricity from the grid and transforming it into something else. Could it affect people? Make them disappear?" "I don't see how," David said, though he didn't sound entirely certain. But these electromagnetic field levels could definitely cause neurological effects. Headaches, disorientation, maybe even hallucinations if someone was exposed long enough. That matched what the neighbor had told me about Luis acting strangely before he disappeared. And it might explain the phenomena Sophia and I had experienced: the lost time, the whispered voices, the sense of presence. "Can you disable it?" I asked. David studied the device carefully. "Probably, but I'd recommend we document everything first. Maybe get an expert to analyze this. Whatever it is, someone went to a lot of trouble to build and install it. This isn't amateur work." We spent the next hour photographing and measuring the device, documenting its connections to the building's wiring and the electromagnetic fields it was generating. As we worked, I became aware of that familiar sensation, the feeling of being watched, of a presence in the apartment that was paying attention to what we were doing. The lights flickered once, briefly, then stabilized. David's equipment showed a surge in the readings, a spike in electromagnetic activity that didn't correspond to anything we were doing. "You see that?" David asked, pointing at his oscilloscope. "The device just activated, even though we haven't touched anything. Can devices activate themselves? Not normally, no." He adjusted his equipment, trying to capture the readings. "It's almost like it's responding to us being here, like it's aware of our presence." The lights flickered again, more persistently this time. And in the darkness between flickers, I heard it, that whispered voice, "Come back, come back." David heard it too. I could see it in the way he tensed, his head turning toward the sound. "What was that?" "You tell me," I said. "Is there any way your device could generate sound?" "No. It works with electrical signals and electromagnetic fields. It can't create auditory phenomena." The whispered words came again, clearer this time. "Come back, come back, come back. We need to leave," David said, already starting to pack up his equipment. "Whatever's happening here, it's beyond my expertise. This isn't just an electrical problem." But before we could move toward the door, the lights went out completely. Not gradually, not with warning, just suddenly dark, as if someone had flipped a switch. Our flashlights activated automatically, cutting beams through the blackness. In the light from our flashlights, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The walls of the apartment were moving, not physically, but in some other way, rippling, distorting, as if the space itself were becoming unstable. And in the corners where the shadows were deepest, I could see shapes forming, dark silhouettes that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. "Out," I said, "now." We grabbed what equipment we could and moved towards the door. Behind us, I could hear that whispered voice multiplying, becoming a chorus of voices all speaking in unison. "Come back, come back, come back." We burst through the door into the hallway, and immediately the lights came back on. The apartment behind us was quiet, still, showing no sign of the phenomena we'd just experienced. David was pale, his hands shaking as he clutched his equipment. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think we just discovered why people disappear from this apartment." We retreated to my vehicle and sat there for several minutes, both of us trying to process what we'd witnessed. David's equipment had captured some of it, the electromagnetic surges, the unusual waveforms, but not the most disturbing elements. Not the voices, not the shadows forming in the corners, not the sense of the space itself becoming hostile to our presence. "I need to file a report about that device," David said finally. "It's definitely illegal, possibly dangerous. The building owner needs to have it removed." "I agree," I said. "But we both know removing it won't solve the real problem." "What is the real problem?" That was the question I'd been avoiding. because the answer seemed impossible, seemed to violate every principle of rational investigation I'd been trained to follow. "I think someone built that device for a purpose," I said slowly. "To create specific electromagnetic conditions in that apartment. And I think those conditions opened something, created a space where the normal rules don't apply." "That's not scientific," David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, it's not," I agreed. "But neither is what we just experienced." I drove David back to the office, and we spent the next several hours documenting our findings and preparing reports. The technical data was straightforward enough: dangerous electromagnetic fields, illegal electrical modifications, building code violations that justified immediate action. But the rest of it? The whispered voices, the shadows in the corners, the sense of space becoming unstable, that we left out of the official report. Some things couldn't be documented in language that would be taken seriously. What I did include was a recommendation that Apartment 3C be declared uninhabitable, pending removal of the unauthorized electrical device and a complete inspection of the building's wiring. The building owner wasn't happy about it, but with federal authorization behind the order, he didn't have much choice. The electrician, not Carlos this time, but a specialist from the Bureau's forensic team, removed the device 2 days later. It was sent to a lab for analysis, though I doubted they'd be able to determine its true purpose. Some things existed beyond the scope of scientific instruments. With the device gone, the electromagnetic readings in Apartment 3C returned to normal levels. The power fluctuations in the building stopped. Everything seemed to stabilize. But I knew it wasn't over. Whatever that device had opened, or created, or allowed to exist in that apartment, removing the device wouldn't necessarily close it. The space had been changed in ways that might be permanent. And somewhere I was certain Luis Moreno and possibly Marcus Diaz had found out what lay on the other side of that opening. They'd been called back, just like the voice had called to us. The question was, called back to what? And was there any way to bring them home? The official case file on the Little Havana apartment was closed 2 weeks after David and I removed the illegal electrical device. The Bureau's forensic team had analyzed the component we'd found behind the wall and concluded it was a custom-built electromagnetic field generator, possibly constructed sometime in the 1970s based on the components used. Its purpose remained unclear. The report speculated it might have been part of some experimental technology, or possibly built by someone with an amateur interest in electromagnetic phenomena. Luis Moreno remained a missing person. Marcus Diaz's whereabouts were unknown. Both cases were filed as unsolved, though the official explanation was that both men had fled the Miami area for reasons unrelated to the apartment or the device we'd found there. I knew better, but I couldn't prove anything. And after my supervisor made it clear that I was spending too much time on a closed case, I was forced to move on to other investigations. But I couldn't stop thinking about Apartment 3C, couldn't stop hearing that whispered voice calling me back. And I kept wondering, if the device had been removed, what was still in that apartment? What had been created or opened or allowed to exist there during the decades it had been active? 3 weeks after the case officially closed, I received a package at my apartment. No return address, just my name and address written in neat block letters on plain brown paper. Inside was an old cassette tape, the kind people used for home recordings back in the 1980s, and a note written on yellowed paper. The note read, "Found this in the wall behind the device. Thought you should have it. CM. CM. Carlos Martinez, the electrician who'd first told me about the strange wiring in the building. He must have gone back, done some additional investigation, found this tape hidden somewhere in the apartment's walls. I hadn't owned a cassette player in years, but I tracked one down at a pawn shop the next day. That evening, I sat in my apartment with the tape loaded, my hand hovering over the play button, uncertain if I really wanted to hear what was recorded on it. But curiosity won out. I pressed play. At first, there was just static and the hiss of blank tape. Then a voice emerged, male, middle-aged, speaking English with a slight accent I couldn't place. This is Dr. Michael Brenner, recording on September 14, 1974. I'm documenting my progress with what I'm calling the convergence experiment. A pause, the sound of papers rustling. For the past 3 years, I've been researching the intersection of electromagnetic fields and consciousness. My hypothesis is that specific EM field configurations can create resonance conditions that allow for interaction with what I can only describe as adjacent spaces, dimensions or realities that exist parallel to our own but are normally inaccessible. Another pause. When the voice continued, there was excitement in it, almost manic energy. I've constructed a device capable of generating the precise field conditions I believe are necessary. It's been installed in a residential apartment, 847 Calle Ocho, Unit 3C, where I've been conducting experiments. The landlord thinks I'm just a tenant with a hobby. He has no idea what I'm really doing. The recording continued. Dr. Brenner describing his work in technical detail that I could only partially follow. He talked about harmonic frequencies, field resonance, quantum entanglement. Most of it was beyond my understanding, but the core idea was clear. He believed he'd found a way to open a gateway to somewhere else. September 28, 1974. First successful contact. The device has been active for 2 weeks, and tonight I finally experienced a response. I heard a voice, or multiple voices, speaking in the walls. They seemed to be calling to me, inviting me to cross over. The recording jumped forward. The date now, October 5th. The voices are constant now. They're getting clearer, more insistent. I can understand some of what they're saying. They want me to come through, to join them in their space. They promise knowledge, understanding, experiences beyond human comprehension. October 12th. I've decided to do it, to cross over. The device is generating stable field conditions, and I believe the gateway is fully open now. This will be my final recording in this reality. If anyone finds this tape, know that I went willingly. I wasn't coerced or confused. I chose to explore what lies beyond. There was a long pause, then Dr. Brenner's voice one more time, distant and strange, as if he were already partially somewhere else. One warning. Once you hear the voices, once they begin calling to you, it's nearly impossible to resist. They pull at something deep inside, something that wants to cross over, wants to see what's on the other side. My advice to anyone who finds my work: don't activate the device. Don't open the gateway. Some doorways should remain closed. The recording ended with a sound I couldn't identify, like wind rushing through a narrow space or voices speaking in a language human vocal cords couldn't produce. Then static and silence. I sat in my apartment for a long time after the tape ended, processing what I'd heard. Dr. Michael Brenner had built the device we'd found in apartment 3C. He'd created it deliberately to open what he called a gateway to an adjacent reality. And then he'd crossed over, vanished into whatever lay on the other side. That had been in 1974, 50 years ago. The device had remained active all that time, hidden behind the walls of the apartment, continuing to generate its electromagnetic fields and keep the gateway open. And over the years, others had heard the voices, felt the pull, and crossed over just like Brenner had. Luis Moreno, possibly Marcus Diaz, maybe others whose disappearances hadn't been connected to that apartment. And now the device was gone, removed by bureau technicians and sent to a lab. But the gateway, was it still open? Had removing the device closed it, or did it exist independently now, a permanent tear in the fabric of reality that would continue to pull people in? I had to know. Against every instinct that told me to leave it alone, to file the tape with the case evidence and forget about it, I knew I had to go back to that apartment one more time. Sophia wasn't answering her phone, and I didn't bother trying David. I knew what they'd both say. This was something I had to do alone. I arrived at 847 Calle Ocho just after midnight on a Friday. The building was quiet, most residents already asleep. I let myself in with the key I'd kept from our previous investigation and climbed the now familiar stairs to the third floor. The hallway was dark except for the flickering fluorescent light, the same light that had malfunctioned during our first visit, apparently never properly repaired. Apartment 3C's door was closed, showing no signs of recent activity. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, activating my flashlight. The apartment looked exactly as it had when we'd removed the device. Empty furniture, bare walls, nothing obviously wrong. But I could feel it immediately, the presence, the sense of something waiting in the darkness. The device might be gone, but whatever it had opened was still here. I moved through the apartment slowly, my light sweeping across walls and corners. Everything looked normal, and yet nothing felt normal. The air was too still, too heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm. In the bedroom, I knelt where David and I had found the device behind the access panel. The panel had been sealed again, but I could still feel electromagnetic energy radiating from the wall, weaker than before but still present. And I could hear them now, the voices. Not loud, not distinct, but definitely there. A murmur of sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves, rising and falling in patterns that might have been language. Come back, come back, come back. The same words we'd heard before, but now I understood what they meant. Not return here, but come backward, come back through the gateway, back to the other side where everyone who'd crossed over was waiting. I pulled out my phone to record what I was experiencing, but before I could activate the camera, the lights went out. Not just in the apartment, in the entire building. A power failure, sudden and complete, plunging everything into darkness. My flashlight beam seemed weaker than it should be, barely penetrating the blackness around me. And in that darkness, I saw them, the shadows forming in the corners, taking shape, becoming almost solid. They weren't threatening exactly, just present, watching, waiting. Come back. The voice was clearer now, almost recognizable. It sounded like Luis Moreno, the apartment's former tenant, speaking from somewhere beyond the walls, from whatever space he'd crossed into. Come back. Join us. See what we've seen. I wanted to run, wanted to get out of that apartment and never return. But I was also fascinated, drawn toward the shadows in a way I couldn't fully resist. Part of me wanted to know what they'd discovered, what lay on the other side of the gateway Dr. Brenner had opened 50 years ago. My phone vibrated in my hand. A text from Sophia. Where are you? Been trying to reach you. Something's wrong. That message, that simple reminder that I existed in this reality with people who cared about what happened to me, was enough to break the pull. I backed toward the door, my light still trained on the shadows that were slowly advancing across the room. Come back. Come back. No, I said aloud, not tonight. I made it to the hallway and pulled the door shut behind me. The moment it closed, the power came back on, the lights flickering to life throughout the building. I could hear confused voices from other apartments, residents wondering about the outage. I left the building quickly, not looking back, and drove home with the distinct sensation that I'd narrowly avoided something I didn't fully understand. The gateway was still open in apartment 3C. The voices were still calling, and they would continue to call to anyone who spent time in that space, pulling at them, inviting them to cross over. The next morning, I submitted an additional report recommending that apartment 3C be permanently sealed and the building be subject to regular monitoring for electromagnetic anomalies. My supervisor read the report with obvious skepticism, but ultimately approved it. The apartment was sealed with metal plating, and the door was welded shut. The landlord was instructed to never rent that unit again. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. The gateway existed in more dimensions than the 3 we could seal. It would continue to pull, continue to call, waiting patiently for someone to open that door again. Dr. Brenner's tape remained in my possession. I never submitted it as evidence, partly because I knew it wouldn't be taken seriously, partly because I wasn't sure what the Bureau would do if they believed it. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share. Sometimes, late at night, when my apartment is quiet, I can still hear the echo of those voices. Come back. Come back. They're not calling to me specifically, I think. They're just calling, the way they've been calling for 50 years, the way they'll probably continue calling for 50 more. Luis Moreno is gone. Marcus Diaz, if he was ever really in that apartment, is gone too. They crossed over, joined Dr. Brenner, and whoever else had heard the voices over the years and couldn't resist the pull. The official file says they disappeared, location unknown, circumstances suspicious but unexplained. That's close enough to the truth for government work. But I know better. I know where they went, even if I don't fully understand what that place is. They went through the gateway, crossed over into that adjacent space Dr. Brenner had been so excited to explore. And maybe they found what they were looking for. Maybe it's beautiful and enlightening and everything Brenner had promised. Or maybe it's something else entirely. Maybe it's a trap, a lure, a way for something on the other side to pull people through one by one until the gateway is strong enough to stay open permanently. I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to find out. The body camera footage from my final visit to the apartment was corrupted, just like all our previous recordings from that location. But this time, there was something different in the corruption. In the static and digital noise, I could make out shapes, brief flickers of image that looked almost like people standing in darkness, staring back at the camera. I spent hours analyzing that footage, frame by frame, trying to make out details. In one frame, I'm almost certain I can see a face. It might be Luis Moreno, or it might be Dr. Brenner, or it might be someone who crossed over decades ago and has been waiting there ever since. The face is pale, distant, almost translucent, and it's smiling. That smile haunts me more than anything else, because it suggests that whatever lies on the other side of the gateway, it's not entirely terrible. People cross over willingly. They choose to leave everything behind and step through into that adjacent space. And once they're there, they smile back at those of us still on this side. They call to us. They invite us to join them. Come back. I keep that corrupted footage archived on a secure drive. Sometimes I watch it, studying those shadowy shapes, trying to understand what they're trying to tell me. The smile, the invitation, the promise of something beyond ordinary human experience. But I don't go back to the apartment. I've closed that case, sealed that door, walked away from that particular mystery. There are some things an FBI agent doesn't need to investigate. Some doors that should remain closed. Some invitations that should be politely declined. The apartment remains sealed. The gateway hidden behind metal plates and a welded door. The building continues to have occasional electrical problems. Nothing as dramatic as before, but enough to make me wonder if the gateway is still pulling power from the grid, still maintaining itself in whatever trans-dimensional space it occupies. And somewhere in that building, trapped in the walls or existing in dimensions we can't perceive, those voices continue to call. Patient, persistent, waiting for the next person who gets too close, listens too carefully, and can't resist the pull of whatever lies beyond. This is the case I couldn't solve. The mystery I couldn't unravel. Not because I didn't find evidence. I found plenty. But because the evidence pointed to conclusions that don't fit into bureau reports, that can't be discussed in official language, that challenge every assumption about how reality works. Dr. Brenner opened a gateway 50 years ago, and it's still open. People cross through it, vanish from this world, and reappear as shadows calling back to those they've left behind. That's the truth of Apartment 3C, the secret of 847 Calle Ocho, and I'm the only one who fully understands it. The only one who's heard the voices, felt the pull, and managed to walk away. The only one who knows what really happened to Luis Moreno and all the others. I carry that knowledge with me every day, and every night, in the quiet darkness of my apartment, I hear the echo of those voices calling across dimensions, inviting me back to that place I barely escaped. Come back. Come back. Come back. But I won't. I can't. Because I have a feeling that if I cross that threshold, if I step through that gateway into whatever lies beyond, I won't just disappear. I'll become one of the voices, calling back to the next investigator, the next curious soul who gets too close. And that's a fate I'm not ready to accept. Not yet. Not ever, if I can help it. The case is closed. The apartment is sealed. The mystery remains unsolved in any official capacity, and that's how it needs to stay. Some doors should never have been opened, and once opened, they can never truly be closed again. They just wait, patient and hungry, for the next person to hear the call. I hope that person isn't you, but if you ever find yourself in Little Havana, standing outside a pink stucco building on Calle Ocho, and you feel a pull toward the third floor, toward a welded door that shouldn't be opened, walk away. Don't listen to the voices. Don't try to understand the mystery. Just walk away. Because some invitations, no matter how tempting, should always be declined.